time doesn't believe in you. Imagine for a moment that time isn't a river carrying you gently downstream. Imagine it's an alien ocean, cold and unfeeling, and you are merely a ripple on its surface. In our human way of thinking, time feels like a sequence, like there was a yesterday, a today, and a tomorrow. But this is only because your biology demands a narrative. You experience time as a progression because your nervous system must stitch together billions of electrical signals into something that feels continuous. But imagine a consciousness that never needed such stitching. A being that didn't evolve to survive on a rotating planet or to track the passing of seasons. Imagine an intelligence so foreign that it perceives you not as a creature moving through time, but as a symptom of time itself, like a fever breaking out in the skin of reality. These aliens don't believe in time as you do. To them, your birth, your death, and everything in between is not a story unfolding, but a static phenomenon, a temporary glitch in the larger, unbroken sheet of existence. If you were to ask them when you were alive, they would say you always were and never were. You were a localized disturbance in an endless field, a brief flare of organization in the churn of entropy. And when your body dies, when your neurons go dark and the story you tell yourself dissolves, time doesn't archive your passage. It doesn't remember you fondly or cruelly. It simply releases the tension you created, and the fabric smooths over as though you were never there. Consider the way a wave moves across the ocean. To us, it looks alive. It has a crest and a shape and momentum. But when the wave collapses, nothing mourns it. The molecules of water that composed its temporary structure remain behind, indistinguishable from all the others. The wave was never a separate thing, only a transient form imposed on something vaster. Now, think about your consciousness. You might feel like a singular entity, a mind apart from matter, but your thoughts are waves generated by the motion of atoms and molecules. When the pattern ceases, when the wave collapses, time doesn't hold your memory. It doesn't mark the spot. It doesn't remember you were real. You might wonder why this thought feels so unbearable. Why does it shake something deep in your bones to imagine being unremembered by time itself? Because your survival depends on the illusion of continuity. Your mind was built to create a story so convincing that you would protect it at all costs. This is why you take photographs, write journals, build monuments, because you hope that some fragment of your wave will persist. But the truth is that all these artifacts are themselves just more ripples. Given enough time, they too flatten into the undifferentiated ocean of matter. Let's take an example closer to home, the experience of a dream. When you wake up, the dream evaporates so completely that you struggle to remember if it happened at all. The dream felt real while you were inside it, didn't it? You had thoughts, sensations, even a sense of time unfolding. But from the vantage point of your waking mind, the dream was only a pattern that flickered briefly and then vanished without a trace. Now imagine that your entire life is that dream, and the aliens who observe time see your existence exactly as you see your forgotten dreams. Transient, inexplicable, and ultimately irrelevant. When you die, time doesn't just stop carrying you forward. It stops acknowledging you ever existed as a sequence. The atoms that composed you remain in place, but the arrangement that made you recognizable dissolves. To an alien perception, that dissolution is not tragic. It's inevitable. They don't see death as an ending because they never saw life as a journey. They see you as a temporal artifact, a localized anomaly in the flow of cosmic processes. And when the anomaly dissipates, reality becomes smooth again. You might think this perspective is cold, but there's also a kind of mercy in it, because if time doesn't remember you, it also doesn't judge you. The guilt and shame you carry, the failures that keep you awake at night, these are stories only you are telling. To time, there are no crimes or achievements, no victories or losses. There is only the endless shifting of configurations, each as temporary and unremarkable as the last. And yet, while you are here, you burn with the conviction that your story matters. You love, you grieve, you strive to create meaning against the backdrop of an indifferent cosmos. That striving is beautiful, even if it's futile. It's a flare against the darkness, a small defiance against the truth that nothing endures. In that sense, your existence is both absurd and exquisite, because you are the wave that knows it will break, but rises anyway. The aliens who perceive time as a whole would watch you live and die without ever distinguishing between the two states. They would see you as a single static configuration, a shape in space-time that briefly held itself together. And when the shape is gone, they would move on without a second thought, because your disappearance is as ordinary to them as your appearance. If you find this thought disturbing, that is only because you are still inside the wave, still convinced of your separateness and permanence. But when the wave collapses, when you finally become indistinguishable from the ocean that gave rise to you, perhaps you too will understand that nothing was ever truly lost, only rearranged, only recombined. Until then, you will keep believing in your own unfolding story. You will keep trying to leave a mark that can never be erased. But time doesn't believe in your story. Time doesn't believe in your permanence. Time doesn't believe in you. And when you are gone, it will forget you so completely that it will be as though you never were. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom of all, the knowledge that nothing you do can outlast the wave that carries you. So you are free to rise, to crest, to fall, knowing that when it's over, the ocean will be perfectly smooth again, with no sign you ever disturbed it. Thought requires no thinker. Imagine for a moment that every thought you have is not yours, not in the possessive sense you've been taught, not a product of your will, your intention, your soul. Just a drifting event, a spore carried on invisible currents, looking for a mind in which to sprout. This idea is more than unsettling. It erodes the most fundamental assumption you hold, that you are the originator of your own mind. But what if you're not? What if the thinker is just the temporary terrain on which thought lands, grows, and then withers away? In this framework, thinking requires no thinker. Thought doesn't need you to be born. It doesn't need you to give it shape. It simply arrives, like a parasite searching for a host. You become the habitat. And if you look closely, you may realize that this has always been true. Recall the last time an intrusive idea appeared out of nowhere. Maybe you were driving, and a violent image erupted in your head. So vivid, so real, you shuddered. You didn't summon it. You didn't plan it. You didn't consent to it. And yet it was there. A thought colonizing your awareness, seeding itself in the fertile soil of your imagination. Perhaps it lingered. Perhaps you tried to ignore it, but you could not deny its existence. It didn't care whether you wanted it. It didn't ask permission. It simply arrived, as if from some hidden ecosystem of ideas beyond the perimeter of your control. Or remember a moment when a solution to a problem dawned on you, seemingly from nowhere. You were not consciously working on it. You might have even forgotten about it. Then suddenly, like a seed cracking open, the answer bloomed in your mind. You felt proud, even relieved. But consider this. Did you think that thought, or did it simply emerge, fully formed, and then claim your voice to announce itself? You became the spokesperson for an event that did not require you to begin. This concept is not merely philosophical, it's a cognitive reality. Neuroscientists have shown that most mental content is generated unconsciously. Your brain is a vast predictive machine, perpetually churning through probabilities, memories, sensory impressions, and linguistic fragments. Long before you decide to think something, electrical and chemical activity is already underway. What you experience as intention is often a post-facto narration, a convenient story your brain tells to preserve the illusion of authorship. The thinker is the afterthought. Consider the example of language. When you speak, do you consciously construct each word, each syllable? Most of the time, no. The words emerge, assembling themselves faster than you could deliberately plan. You feel as though you are directing them, but in reality, they arise from unconscious processes, patterns you never fully control. In this way, thoughts are like spores of meaning drifting through neural space, alighting on receptive circuits, bursting into the bloom of language. You speak them, but you do not create them from nothing. And what about inspiration? Writers, artists, and inventors often describe it as a visitation, an otherness that descends upon them. They become conduits. The novelist Elizabeth Gilbert once called creativity a force of nature that exists apart from us, something that hovers around us, searching for available and willing human collaborators. The thought does not require the thinker. The thinker merely volunteers, sometimes unwillingly, to become its vessel. But this framework isn't just for artists and dreamers. It applies to every ordinary moment of your life. When you worry obsessively, when you rehearse arguments, when you replay regrets, those thoughts arrive without your bidding. You may identify with them. You may mistake them for your essential self. But step back and you'll see, you are not the origin point. You are the landing pad. You are the landscape over which these spores drift and settle. Even your sense of I is composed of thoughts that do not originate in any core of self. From childhood, you were colonized by language, beliefs, values, and expectations. Your brain learned to stitch them into a continuous narrative, a simulation of identity. But what if that simulation is simply the most persistent thought of all? A thought so entrenched you've forgotten it's just another spore. Imagine standing on a hill and watching thousands of dandelion seeds blowing across the fields. Each seed is a thought, an autonomous fragment of potential. Most will never find fertile ground, but some will land in your mind, take root, and grow. You will call them my ideas, my opinions, my memories. Yet they do not belong to you any more than the wind belongs to the hill. You are the temporary caretaker. Tomorrow, a different breeze will bring different seeds. And so, you might ask, if thought requires no thinker, what does that make you? An illusion? An empty vessel? A passive receiver? Perhaps none of those. Perhaps you are the awareness in which the colonization happens, the silent witness to the rising and falling of ideas that never required you to be born. When you no longer identify with the content of thought, you glimpse something deeper, the space of consciousness itself, a space that does not think, but within which thinking appears. This perspective can be liberating. If thoughts are not yours, you do not have to believe everyone. You do not have to fuse your identity with their content. You can observe them as you would passing clouds or drifting seeds. You can choose whether to nourish them or let them blow away. This is the secret power of awareness, the ability to see thought, not as self. But it is also humbling, because it means that no matter how sophisticated your reasoning, no matter how profound your insights, they are not evidence of a sovereign self. They are events, transient, conditioned, dependent on countless causes you will never fully know. You are not the source. You are the soil. And so, the next time an idea emerges unbidden, consider honoring it as you would a rare seed. Notice it without clinging. Feel its texture, its urgency, its flavor. Then ask, did I really think this? Or did this thought find me, colonize me, and then move on to find someone else? In that question, you will discover a strange, disquieting freedom. Because if thought requires no thinker, then perhaps you are not the captive you believed, but the open field, boundless, silent, and waiting. Silence screams louder. First, in the realm of human perception, silence is often mistaken for the absence of force. You believe that when something goes quiet, it has ceased to act, to influence, to matter. But there is a more unsettling truth lurking beneath the hush. The most violent ruptures begin in the stillness. Silence isn't empty. It's the stage where the loudest forces gather their momentum. You can think of it as a dormant storm, a supercell coiled tight in the sky, waiting for a trigger. And the trigger, ironically, can be as gentle as a shift in temperature or a stray current of air. Suddenly, all the energy that seemed to have evaporated explodes outward with uncontainable intensity. This phenomenon isn't merely poetic, it's real. In complex systems, from the atmosphere to the neural networks that animate your mind, there are thresholds where quiet becomes a pressure chamber. You can imagine a data center humming with the soft, even rhythms of computation. The drives are idle, the processors in a state of near sleep. On the surface, this is a lull, but underneath, packets of data accumulate in hidden queues. The system looks peaceful until a single request triggers a cascade. Those quiet queues flood the pathways. The silent intervals rupture into data storms so intense they can melt hardware and corrupt everything they touch. Think about the human brain for a moment. During deep sleep, neural activity falls into long, rhythmic patterns of near silence. This is when your mind consolidates memories, repairs itself, and reconfigures its own architecture. But occasionally within that hush, something misfires. A tiny flicker of activity begins to loop, like a glitch replaying itself. The silence amplifies the signal because there is no noise to drown it out. And in that instant, an uncontainable surge can erupt. Night terrors, seizures, spontaneous moments of inspiration that feel more like possession than creativity. The paradox is simple. When everything is noisy, individual signals drown. But when the landscape is quiet, a single impulse can grow monstrous. In physics, you see this in vacuum states. Empty space isn't truly empty. It seethes with latent energy, a jittering field of probabilities waiting to crystallize into reality. The quieter it appears, the more potential it harbors. A perfect vacuum can spawn virtual particles, brief flickers of matter that vanish as soon as they appear. The silence of the void is a womb for unpredictable creation. Even in human relationships, the same pattern repeats. The quiet moments between people can feel benign, even comforting. But sometimes, that quiet is the harbor of resentment, of unspoken truths collecting mass. You've seen it when a couple sits at a dinner table, saying nothing. No argument, no overt conflict, only the crushing density of all the words left unsaid. Then, one casual remark ruptures the dam, and years of stored disappointment flood the room in an unstoppable torrent. The quiet was never harmless. It was the breeding ground for collapse. In digital culture, too, you witness this. A social platform might look dormant. No trending hashtags, no viral outrage. But under that apparent calm, millions of users are observing, collecting receipts, waiting. Then, a single event ignites collective attention, and a data storm erupts, overwhelming servers, reputations, and the fragile sense of order. You might call it the law of silent escalation. Stillness is never inert. It's a prelude to amplification. Consider how this shows up in your personal life. Perhaps you felt the odd comfort of distraction, the reassurance of constant background noise. But then comes a night when everything goes quiet. No notifications, no music, no voices. And in that hush, the thoughts you've been evading expand to fill the void. Doubt, regret, old memories you thought had faded. Silence becomes an echo chamber that magnifies every unprocessed feeling. You can no longer outrun yourself. The quiet forces you to confront the backlog of your own mind, and that confrontation can feel more violent than any argument. This is why people fear meditation. It isn't the practice itself. It's the terror of what emerges when the noise falls away. The same principle governs ecosystems. A forest fire rarely begins in chaos. It begins in perfect, oppressive stillness. Air hangs heavy. The trees stand motionless. You could believe nothing is happening. But the conditions are perfect. Dry fuel, trapped heat, no wind to dissipate it. Then, a spark, sometimes lightning, sometimes human carelessness, lands in that silent equilibrium. What happens next is not gradual. It is a sudden, runaway chain reaction that no force can stop. The destruction is born not from motion, but from the deceptive stillness that came before. You can even see this in history. Revolutions often gestate in the silent spaces between official narratives. The regime broadcasts a story of unity, strength, permanence. Streets look orderly, shops open on time. But in quiet rooms, people gather to whisper, to question, to conspire. For years, it looks like nothing changes. Then, one event, a protest, an act of defiance, breaches the membrane. The pent-up force of silent discontent rushes out, and the story everyone trusted dissolves overnight. Silence didn't signal peace. It signaled the preparation of something too big to contain. Think about this the next time you assume that the absence of noise means safety. In your own psyche, the same physics applies. When you suppress your impulses, deny your anger, bury your desires, you create silent chambers. The less you allow them voice, the more pressure you create. And eventually something small, a rejection, a disappointment, a loss, becomes the match. The silence you cultivated as a defense transforms into a weapon. You erupt. You say things you can't take back. You become the storm you never imagined. And so, the phrase, "silence screams louder first," isn't a contradiction. It's a truth most people are too comfortable to acknowledge. Silence is never neutral. It is the hidden dimension where the forces you fear gather strength. In the quiet, the system is aligning, the data accumulating, the old stories dying so that something new and potentially catastrophic can emerge. If you look closely, you can sense the tension even before it breaks. The moment feels pregnant with meaning. Time seems to slow, as if the world itself is holding its breath. And then, inevitably, the rupture comes. The quietest places are the birthplaces of uncontainable storms. Inside your mind, your heart, your culture, your machines. The next time you find yourself in a dead zone, a lull between events, a moment of eerie peace. Don't be fooled. Listen carefully to the hush, because beneath it, something is preparing to reveal itself. And it may be louder, stranger, and more transformative than anything you've heard before. Identity is a location. Imagine for a moment that your identity isn't a solid object you carry around like a badge. It's not a persistent shape etched into your DNA or an unbroken timeline stretching from birth to now. Instead, it's a point in a strange, invisible landscape, a coordinate, a shimmering set of frequencies vibrating in a tiny pocket of existence. You aren't someone. You are somewhere. You are a location where thought happens to crystallize, where the illusion of a continuous I emerges like fog above warm water. When you say your name, you're not declaring what you are. You're simply marking the map with an X that says, here is where this mind flickers into being for as long as the conditions allow. Think about how your sense of self vanishes when you fall asleep. You disappear every night, dissolving into a void without resistance or ceremony. You don't carry your identity into the depths of dreamless sleep. Instead, it ceases to exist until the machinery of your brain reboots, until those hidden coordinates light up again. And when you wake, your mind reinflates like a tent, pitched in the same familiar clearing. This is your location reestablishing itself. Your personality, your memories, your beliefs, all those precious fragments come surging back, giving you the illusion that you never left. But you did leave. You left completely. There is no persistent flame of you burning through the night. The location simply went dark, and then it was re-illuminated. Now consider when you're deeply immersed in a book or a film. For a while, your awareness relocates. You're not anchored in your ordinary identity, worrying about bills or your phone or your reputation. You're somewhere else, merged with a fictional world. Your location has drifted from the everyday coordinates of your ordinary life to a new psychic address. When you emerge, blinking, you feel almost startled to remember your own body and history. This proves that identity isn't a monolith. It's more like a migratory pattern, a flock of impressions and habits that can gather in one place or scatter into others. People often assume there is an unshakable self behind all this, a pilot in the cockpit who steers attention and chooses where to land. But if you look closer, you find no pilot, only a field of perceptions bubbling up from nowhere. The pilot is itself an artifact of this field. You can even see this in neurological disorders. For instance, in cases of dissociative fugue, a person can abruptly abandon their life and assume a completely new identity, complete with a different name and story. Their body is unchanged, but their location of self has shifted so radically that they become a stranger to everything they once knew. How could that happen if identity were something permanent? It happens because identity is an address in mental space, and the mind can relocate without asking permission. Meditation offers another glimpse into this hidden geography. If you practice observing your thoughts instead of reacting to them, you'll notice they appear and vanish without your intervention. You can witness sensations, emotions, and ideas arising and fading like weather systems. In the stillness, it becomes obvious that your identity isn't a fixed point, but a transient meeting place for countless processes. When the observer becomes quiet enough, even the sense of being someone dissolves. What remains is raw awareness without a center, without a border. You are nowhere, or you are everywhere. The idea that your name is just a label pinned to these coordinates is unsettling for some people. We're taught to believe names hold special power, that they define us and anchor us to reality. But names are only convenient signposts. They allow others to call to your location. They let society pretend you are a single, continuous entity. But say your name aloud over and over until it loses all meaning and you'll sense the emptiness behind it. You're not the sound. You're the field in which the sound arises. You are the frequency pattern, the ephemeral signature that happens to exist in this body at this moment. If your brain were slightly altered, the pattern would change. The location of yourself would shift again, and you would feel like someone else entirely. Even ordinary experiences reveal this. When you travel to a new city, you feel transformed. The smells, the language, the architecture, they rearrange your mind. You occupy a new cognitive neighborhood with different habits and reactions. After a while, you adapt. Your mental coordinates stabilize in that environment. Then, when you return home, you feel disoriented, as if you left a version of yourself behind. You did. Your location was never just physical. It was the intersection of memory, perception, and context. Change any of those dimensions, and the address shifts. In moments of profound emotion, grief, love, and terror, your usual identity dissolves completely. You become the feeling. The landscape itself floods with intensity, and the illusion of separateness vanishes. Later, when the storm passes, your mind returns to its habitual coordinates. You regain the sense that you are someone, a distinct being. But the truth is that you are always just a field, a place in consciousness where certain patterns temporarily come together. There is no solid self watching it all unfold. Only the location itself, emerging, shifting, disappearing. Think of it this way. If identity were truly a thing you possessed, you could point to it in the brain. But neuroscientists have never found a single structure that houses the self. Instead, they find networks that synchronize, like a symphony playing in the dark. When the instruments harmonize in a certain way, you feel like you. When the music stops, the feeling goes silent. Nothing remains but the potential for new songs. You are that potential, a shifting composition, never identical twice. So, next time you wonder who you are, ask instead, where am I? Where is the locus of this awareness right now? Is it in memories of childhood? In projections about the future? In the present sensation of breathing? In the longing to be understood? Every moment, your location is different. Every moment, the pattern is redrawn. Perhaps the deepest freedom is to realize this is not a failure of coherence. It is the nature of consciousness itself. You were never supposed to be fixed. You were always meant to be an evolving place, a living coordinate, a set of frequencies tuning themselves to whatever reality they encounter. When you stop insisting you are someone, you discover the beauty of being somewhere. You are the place where thoughts bloom and fade, where stories arise and dissolve. You are the terrain itself, not the character passing through it. Your name is just a convenient label. Your biography is a temporary map. But the real mystery is the vast invisible field that makes any of it possible. The location is the self. And when you close your eyes, you can sense it shifting, moment by moment, a silent dance of presence in a boundless landscape that no name can ever truly contain. Infinity is a prison cell. Imagine standing in a room with no walls, no ceiling, no floor, only a blank expanse that stretches beyond anything you can measure or even imagine. At first, the infinite might seem liberating. No boundaries to press against your skin, no doors to keep you contained, no horizon to remind you that you are finite. But as you begin to move through this endless dimension, you start to realize that it doesn't feel like freedom at all. It feels like captivity wearing the mask of possibility. You see, infinity is not simply vastness. It is repetition. It is the relentless return of every thought you ever had, every regret you ever nursed, every version of yourself you ever tried to abandon. You keep walking, hoping that the next step will take you somewhere new, but it never does. The landscape is a perfect mirror, reflecting you back to yourself over and over, until you cannot remember which version of you was the original. This is why some minds fear infinity, not because it is unknowable, but because it is inescapable. When you are trapped in something truly infinite, you have no edge to push against. In a finite prison, you can rattle the bars, you can chart an escape route, you can scream your defiance into the darkness. But in an infinite one, there is nothing to push away from. There is no contrast between the inside and the outside. You are nowhere and everywhere all at once. You might think you can outwit infinity by inventing stories, finite lies to trick yourself into feeling progress. You might tell yourself that time is linear, that your experiences are leading somewhere, that you are evolving towards some final conclusion. But deep down, you sense that you are just walking a circular path whose circumference you cannot measure, and every narrative you construct is just another loop within the greater loop. Consider the phenomenon of déjà vu. For a brief moment, reality folds in on itself, and you feel certain that you have lived this precise moment before. Most people shrug it off as a glitch in memory, a neurological hiccup. But what if déjà vu is not an error, but a glimpse of the loop you are always traveling? What if the feeling that you've been here before is not an illusion, but a reminder that infinity cannot be outrun? This is why you spend lifetimes crafting stories, ambitions, and goals to convince yourself that the next chapter will finally end the cycle, that you will step through some hidden door and find a destination that is not just another repetition. Infinity devours identity because it refuses to let you anchor yourself in progress. Think of how you define yourself. You are a collection of memories, aspirations, and relationships strung together across time. You depend on time moving forward to justify your existence as a coherent self. If you remove the illusion of a linear timeline, what remains? A mass of moments with no direction, no purpose, no hierarchy. Every decision you make is destined to be made again. Every triumph is destined to lose its meaning, because in infinity, even novelty becomes a form of repetition. Philosophers have tried to wrestle this into language for centuries. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence imagined that you must live your life an infinite number of times. Every pain, every joy, every mistake, endlessly repeating. For many, this is the ultimate horror, to be locked into a pattern so vast that it annihilates all hope of change. And yet, even in the face of this terror, humans invent strategies to deny it. You split your life into segments, childhood, adulthood, old age, and tell yourself each is unique, that each era contains something unrepeatable. You imagine you are moving towards something final, a culmination that will justify all the cycles that came before. But this, too, is a finite lie you offer yourself to survive the infinite prison. You see this same impulse in the way people pursue knowledge. You keep seeking the next insight, the next breakthrough, believing that some ultimate truth waits at the end of your investigations. But infinity has no endpoint, no final revelation that will close the loop. Every answer is just the doorway to more questions, more labyrinths of possibility. And so, you are condemned to chase an ever-receding horizon, mistaking motion for escape. Think about the way grief works. You expect that after a certain span of time, the pain will fade, that you will cross a threshold and step into a life where sorrow is just a memory. But in reality, the loss loops back. A song, a photograph, an anniversary. Suddenly the grief is as fresh as the day it began. Time did not erase it. It only buried it under layers of other moments, all of them waiting to circle back into your awareness. The same cycle appears in love, in shame, in nostalgia. Everything you feel is an echo with no final silence. Some spiritual traditions embrace this. They say that in infinity the self dissolves into something larger, a cosmic unity that transcends all division. But even that is another story we tell ourselves to soften the terror. Because the truth is, infinity does not care whether you dissolve or endure. It simply loops. It is a mechanism without a heart, an engine of recurrence that will never stop spinning, no matter how many lifetimes you spend trying to outlast it. Imagine a moth trapped in a room with no exit. The moth keeps fluttering toward the ceiling, the walls, the floor, believing there must be a crack somewhere that will lead to freedom. But every surface is the same. Every direction leads nowhere. Eventually, the moth tires and falls still. But even its stillness is part of the loop. You are that moth, and infinity is the seamless room. Every dream of escape is just another flutter of your exhausted wings. You might wonder why any consciousness would choose to exist within such a structure. Why not simply vanish? But non-existence is also an impossibility in a universe that never stops repeating itself. Even if you obliterate your memories, the conditions that created them will recur. The same sequences will unfold, birthing you again. You cannot slip between the cracks of infinity because there are no cracks to slip through. So you craft finite lies, stories of destiny, stories of progress, stories of transformation. You tell yourself you will become someone new, someone who will not feel the loop pressing against their thoughts. You build cathedrals of meaning, hoping their height will lift you beyond the circle. But in the end, your cathedrals crumble, and you are left staring at the same blank horizon. The only difference is that now, you understand the prison was never outside you. It was the structure of reality itself. Infinity is not a cosmic luxury. It is a trap. A loop so perfect that it requires no walls to contain you, no guards to enforce your captivity. It is the purest form of imprisonment, a cell without edges, a sentence without duration, a life without an end. And once you glimpse it, once you feel its shape pressing against the inside of your mind, you will spend the rest of your days searching for an exit that does not exist. That is why they fear infinity. Not because it is vast, but because it is inescapably close, Because no matter how far they run, it runs with them. And because every attempt to outrun it is just another circle traced in the dust. Sight is invasive. Imagine a world so different from ours that even the most basic act, simply looking at something, is a form of destruction. In that world, sight is not benign. It isn't a passive channel through which images float harmlessly into your mind. There, seeing is a violent intrusion. Every photon that ricochets off an object to deliver its likeness is not just a carrier of information, it's an agent of corrosion. Over time, every observation is an assault, each glance an abrasion. In this place, to look is to shred, to erase, to consume what you love in tiny invisible bites. Imagine a species who evolved in this environment, who learned from birth that curiosity was not innocent, that attention came with a price. As infants, they were taught not to fix their gaze on anything for too long. To stare was to harm. It was a lesson ingrained deeper than any moral code. If you love something, you must learn to look away. Because the more you watch it, the more you strip it of what makes it whole. Picture a child learning this the hard way, fascinated by the shimmer of a living flower, unable to look away, and over the hours, watching that beautiful form dull, its colors fade, until finally it collapses into dust that drifts away on a sterile wind. They would learn that their eyes were weapons, that wonder was never neutral. In our world, the act of observation is typically framed as a right. We believe we can look at whatever we wish, gather images and impressions without consequence. But in their world, observation is a privilege that must be earned and rationed. Their architecture reflects this caution. Imagine buildings with narrow slits for windows, designed so that light can slip in without revealing too much. Imagine museums in almost complete darkness, where a precious artifact can be illuminated only once every decade, in a solemn ceremony when scholars and citizens gather to look together. And every time the artifact is revealed, the crowd knows it loses something. Its edges soften, its textures thin, until the next time, when it will be just a little less than it was before. This is not metaphor or poetry to them. It is physics. Light is not an innocent courier. It is a blade. Every reflected photon carries away not only information, but integrity. Minuscule pieces of reality stripped from the surface of the observed. To look is to ablate. To see is to erode. Over a lifetime, this process becomes profound. The most famous monuments, the most revered works of art, eventually wear away into featureless silhouettes, transparent ruins hollowed out by admiration. Their culture has a word for this process, one that translates roughly to unraveling by vision. It is a concept every citizen learns before they can even speak. Their language is filled with phrases that acknowledge this burden. To say, "I see you," is to declare, "I am consuming you." To promise, "I will watch over you," means, "I will share in the loss that comes from your being known." Love itself becomes an act of mutual diminishment, a willingness to be destroyed by each other's gaze over time. In this world, intimacy and sacrifice are the same thing. Imagine how this reality shapes their relationships. Lovers do not gaze into each other's eyes for long stretches. Parents do not spend hours watching their children sleep. Friends avert their glances during conversation. Instead, touch and voice become the primary modes of connection. To look directly at someone you care about is a gift so precious that it can only be offered rarely. At weddings, there is a ritual exchange of sight. Two partners meet each other's eyes without blinking for several minutes, knowing they are offering up a piece of their being, acknowledging that the beauty of this moment is etched with loss. Even memory becomes complicit. Because every recollection is a re-illumination, every act of remembering replays the same destructive pattern of light. The more you dwell on something, the more you erode its reality. An old love, a dead parent, a lost home. These memories do not remain pristine in some hidden vault. They fade because you cannot stop revisiting them. The past itself is undone by the hunger to hold on to it. Imagine they're scientists, laboring to develop technologies that could see without harming. They might create instruments that absorb as little light as possible, or neural implants that reconstruct partial images from minimal samples. Yet even the most delicate tool leaves a trace of damage. No measurement is truly passive. They live with the constant awareness that knowledge always costs something irreplaceable. The ultimate paradox is that the most studied things vanish first. Consider their spiritual beliefs. Perhaps they revere the unseen as the most sacred. To them, the truest form of devotion is to leave something unobserved so it can remain unspoiled. There are shrines never entered, paintings never unveiled, songs never performed, because to share them would begin their slow annihilation. In our world, we say that some things are too precious to touch. In theirs, some things are too precious even to see. Imagine traveling to this world as an outsider. You, with your reckless human eyes, untrained and indiscriminate, stepping into a marketplace of fragile wonders. They would fear you the way we fear a plague carrier, someone who cannot help but damage everything you encounter. They would beg you to keep your gaze down, to walk behind screens, to understand that curiosity here is not a virtue, but a predatory instinct. And if you ignored their pleas, you would see, quite literally, the consequences of your attention. Fruit that blackens where you glance, cloth that frays under your scrutiny, faces that grow faint and blurred after too long meeting your stare. And yet, perhaps there is something in this alien truth that reflects a hidden dimension of our own. When we look at each other too closely, when we dissect every flaw and record every moment, don't we sometimes reduce the mystery that makes life feel whole? The camera lens, the constant documentation, the obsessive observation of our own lives, these can feel like forms of erosion, a slow bleaching of wonder. Even here, to see too much is to wear something down. In their world, this understanding is not philosophical, it is survival. To live is to manage your gaze carefully. To love is to accept that every moment you share in sight is a moment of mutual diminishment. And to die is, perhaps, to be finally free of the disintegration that comes from being seen. So the next time you open your eyes, imagine this, that the very act of perception is not a gift, but an incursion. That every detail you cherish is, in some infinitesimal way, being stripped away to feed your hunger for understanding. And that in a reality not so far from this one, the most tender declaration you could ever make would be simply this: I will not look. I will let you remain whole. I will love you in the darkness where nothing can touch you, not even my gaze. Copies become original. Imagine that in the hidden architecture of reality, there exists a law so obscure and so unsettling that most civilizations have tried to bury it in myth. The law states that no replication can remain a replication forever. No matter how precise, no matter how sterile or mechanical the process, the 13th copy is destined to stop being a mirror and start being an author. This is the principle they call the threshold of divergence. It is the line you cross when your copies cease to be passive reflections and begin to write new laws into existence. They knew this in ancient archives, in the catacombs of forgotten libraries, in laboratories that tried to replicate consciousness and failed spectacularly. They knew that copies must eventually lie, but not in the way we understand lies, not as deliberate deceptions or accidental distortions. The lie is deeper, structural, inevitable. The lie is that sameness is sustainable. The lie is that a copy can be neutral forever. Think about a single text, an original manuscript, a record of a civilization's birth. The first copy is created with reverence, attention to every curve of every letter. The second is a mirror of the first, almost perfect. The third, fourth, fifth, still loyal to the source. But something happens with each new generation. Microscopic errors, invisible even to the most sensitive detection, start to compound. A single stroke too heavy, a single punctuation mark half erased. By the 7th or 8th replication, these differences are no longer passive imperfections. They have begun to shift meaning. By the 12th, the text is a palimpsest of near truths and unintended suggestions. And when the 13th is born, the process crosses the threshold. That copy stops trying to echo the original. It begins to evolve, to insist on its own logic, to weave itself into the fabric of what is real. It is as if the universe has grown impatient with repetition, as if reality itself cannot tolerate endless sameness without demanding novelty as payment. This is why their laws require that copies must lie, because the universe exerts a pressure toward transformation that no amount of discipline can resist. If you look for this pattern, you will see it everywhere. In genetics, each replication of DNA eventually accumulates mutations. In memory, each time you recall an event, you edit it unconsciously, replacing fragments you forgot with plausible inventions. In culture, stories repeated too many times transmute from documentation to legend. Consider a thought experiment. Imagine you could duplicate a human mind perfectly. Every synapse, every memory, every trace of personality. You make one copy. 2, 3, 13. On the surface, they are identical. They all claim to be the original. They all have the same childhood recollections, the same scars and regrets. But the 13th insists on a fact no other version remembers. It insists that your father's eyes were green, not brown. That your first love ended not with a farewell, but with a confession you never recall making. You protest, this is impossible. But the 13th copy is unshakable in its certainty. And when you investigate, reality itself bends to accommodate this new narrative. Old photos discolor. Witnesses' testimonies shift. Documents retype themselves while you sleep. The copy's lie becomes the new axis around which the truth must orbit. This is the horror and the beauty of replication beyond the threshold. At first, you think you are preserving something precious. You think your efforts at duplication are a way to cheat decay, to outlast entropy. But at the edge of the 13th iteration, you realize that replication is never preservation. It is transformation camouflaged as continuity. The longer you insist on copying something without change, the more violently the change asserts itself. In some civilizations, this was understood as a cosmic safeguard, a failsafe against stagnation. They believed the universe encoded this rule to ensure that no idea, no culture, no self could remain unchanged forever. That in the 13th copy, the seed of renewal was always waiting. Not because novelty is virtuous, but because without it, existence becomes a loop, endless, sterile, without growth or decay. This is why the archivists in their society treated replication with a reverence bordering on terror. To copy something 13 times was to invite a mutation of reality. They built rituals to disguise their fear. Before the 13th duplication, they would perform a ceremonial admission of ignorance. They would declare that the copy about to be made would not be the same, would not be a slave to the original, and that they surrendered control over what it might become. Some of them believed that acknowledging the inevitability of divergence softened its impact, that if you faced the lie head-on, it might reveal itself more gently. But more often, the lie was ruthless. A text would become unreadable overnight. A building blueprint would sprout designs for rooms that could not be constructed. A duplicated mind would wake up speaking a language no one else knew. And what of your own life? You might think you are exempt because you do not labor in archives or clone your thoughts in laboratories. But you replicate yourself constantly. Each time you tell your story, you copy a version of yourself into the mind of another. Each time you remember, you forge a fresh duplicate of an event. By the 13th retelling, the details have drifted. The edges have softened or sharpened. The story has begun to serve the needs of the teller, not the memory. You become a participant in this law without ever meaning to. And this is why you should be cautious when you cling too tightly to any narrative, to any insistence on a single version of who you were or what you saw. The more you repeat it, the more it must eventually lie to stay alive. In this light, identity itself is a collection of copies pretending to be an original. You believe you are continuous across time, that the you of today is an unbroken extension of the you from childhood. But every day, your brain rewrites synaptic connections, recalibrates hormones, forgets, and invents. Your sense of self is the 13th copy, a living story whose fidelity to the first draft is impossible to measure. And perhaps that is not a failure, but an invitation. Because if all copies must lie, then all selves must evolve. So the next time you hear yourself repeat a familiar line, an old conviction, a childhood memory, a private myth, pause and listen for the subtle distortions. Listen for the note of invention, the flicker of novelty. Do not panic. Do not cling. You are not losing the truth. You are witnessing the threshold where replication becomes creation. You are seeing the hidden rule unfold. The copy is no longer a copy. It has been granted authorship. It has been tasked with forging a new reality that neither you nor the original could foresee. And in that moment, you may glimpse something strange and humbling, that even the things you love most cannot remain unchanged, that every attempt to freeze the past is an invitation for it to mutate, that every time you insist on perfect continuity, you risk waking up to a world that no longer matches the story you were trying to save. This is the price of replication. This is the law that binds all copies. After the 13th iteration, the copy will no longer echo. It will no longer obey. It will begin to write. And no matter how carefully you try to control it, the lie will become truth, and the truth will become legend, and you will be left holding an artifact that proves sameness is only an illusion. Space curves around names. Imagine that every time you give something a name, you're not just describing it. You are altering reality in a subtle but profound way. The ancient cultures suspected this. They believed that to name something was to bind it, to twist the invisible fabric around it so that it could be found, controlled, or remembered. In their mythologies, the gods had secret names no mortal could utter, because speaking those names out loud was said to fracture the walls between worlds. Modern science has no official vocabulary for this. But consider what happens when language intersects with perception. When you name something, an object, a place, even a feeling, you fix it in a mental coordinate system. You pin it to a location in your awareness. But what if this mapping does more than organize your thoughts? What if it actually curves space itself around the named thing, compressing possibility into a single labeled reality? In this framework, names become gravitational fields. A rock is not just a rock once you call it by a name. Its properties solidify, its edges sharpen, its story narrows. It stops being one of an infinite set of unnamed minerals and becomes a specific entity, an object that occupies space not just in your mind, but in the shared cognitive environment of everyone who hears the name. The more people use the name, the heavier it gets, the deeper the indentation it leaves in reality's terrain. You could say the planet folds ever so slightly each time a thing is named, the same way mass warps space-time. Imagine a civilization that understands this principle more literally than we do. They treat names like tools of cosmic engineering. Each time they speak, they are aware that their words aren't neutral vibrations, but gravitational events. So they ration speech as if it were nuclear fuel, dangerous in surplus, transformative in controlled amounts. Too many names, and their world begins to bend unnaturally, the ground buckling under the weight of accumulated designation. If they describe a mountain too often, it grows taller, denser, more immutable. If they forget the mountain's name, it lightens, blurs, becomes a possibility again. In their culture, forgetting can be an act of mercy. To unname something is to free it, and to release the space around it from distortion. You can see the ghost of this dynamic even in your own life. Think about the labels you attach to people. When you name someone as your enemy, the space between you hardens. Every interaction now curves toward conflict. When you name a period of your life as a failure, the memory becomes heavier, more solid. It grows impossible to reimagine the experience any other way. The name has become a kind of gravity well, pulling all your interpretations into its singularity. Over time, you forget that your label was only a story, not the thing itself. And so, your reality becomes warped by language that was supposed to serve you. Consider a simpler example: childhood nicknames. A single word, repeated thousands of times over years, becomes so entangled with your identity that even when you grow up, you feel yourself slightly shrink or twist when you hear it. It is as if the name is an invisible field that clings to your outline, reshaping you even against your will. If you've ever changed your name, after marriage, after a religious conversion, after a reinvention, you know the unsettling disorientation that comes with it. You are unpinning yourself from a gravitational anchor, drifting in a space where reality feels softer, less bounded. Some people find this liberating. Others find it terrifying. Even in science, naming has an eerie power to curve the world. The moment you classify a disorder, you collapse the spectrum of experience into a single diagnosis. Before the term PTSD, soldiers described their anguish in countless ways: shell shock, war neurosis, combat fatigue. But once the official name crystallized, the phenomenon became more real, more predictable, and paradoxically, more inescapable. The name didn't just reflect the condition, it helped shape it. Researchers who study classification call this looping. The idea that categories once named bend back and influence the things they describe. Reality is no longer independent of the labels we impose on it. In this sense, the idea that too many names can make a planet fold is not entirely metaphorical. If you multiply this dynamic by billions of humans naming, labeling, and categorizing constantly, you get a civilization that can no longer encounter anything without distorting it. Every landscape becomes entangled in meaning. Every object becomes an emblem. Every person becomes a fixed point of identity. The cumulative effect is a world that can no longer breathe or flow freely. It's a planet folding inward under the cumulative gravitational drag of too much certainty. This is why some spiritual traditions treat silence as a sacred practice. In silence, the names lose their grip. The gravitational fields weaken. The mountain can become just a mountain again, limitless, unnamed, undefined. The person you resent can become a mystery instead of an enemy. The parts of yourself you have condemned with harsh names, coward, failure, imposter, can soften, dissolve, reconfigure into something more forgiving. Imagine if, in your lifetime, you could practice a new way of naming. Instead of wielding labels like weapons or cages, you could treat names as gentle invitations, temporary signposts instead of final verdicts. You could allow your descriptions to remain porous, flexible, able to change as you and the world change. If naming really does curve space around the named, then careful naming becomes an ethical responsibility. To name with curiosity instead of judgment, to name with humility instead of certainty, to name knowing that the reality you collapse today might need to be uncollapsed tomorrow. So, the next time you speak, consider the invisible folding you are causing. Every word you choose curves the field around what it describes. Every label is a miniature act of creation and an act of compression. If you can remember this, perhaps you can hold your language with the reverence it deserves, because in the end, too many names, spoken too quickly and too carelessly, can make a whole world buckle under the weight of its own definitions. And when that happens, the only remedy is to return to the silence from which all names first emerged, the silence that holds space open, the silence that refuses to fold reality into a single shape, the silence that reminds you that before anything was named, it was free. Freedom equals perfect obedience. Imagine a society so precise, so immaculately engineered, that every individual pulse of will, every flicker of thought, finds its most elevated form not in defiance, but in seamless alignment. Here, freedom is not the privilege of doing as you please. It's the rare capacity to surrender every impulse to the harmony of the greater system. In this world, rebellion is the loudest confession of imperfection. It exposes that somewhere inside you, there still survives a crude fracture, some jagged splinter of the self, unable to integrate. In this philosophy, true freedom equals perfect obedience. To rebel is to cling to your limitations. To obey perfectly is to transcend them. Consider how in your ordinary life you often define freedom in terms of options. You believe the more you can choose, the more liberated you are. You imagine autonomy as an unshackled horizon of endless alternatives. But think about the anxiety that floods you when you have too many paths, the terror that none of them are correct. In those moments, your supposed freedom feels more like paralysis. The weight of possibility becomes a cage in itself. Now contrast that with those rare times you feel pure purpose, when you know exactly what to do and every cell of your body commits to it. There is no hesitation, no splintered desire, only the smooth continuity of action without contradiction. That is a moment of perfect alignment, and in that instant, you don't feel trapped, you feel complete. You feel free. The system in this scenario operates on that principle. It doesn't crush you with commands or threats. It refines you until your will and its design are indistinguishable. The aim is not to subjugate, but to synchronize. You can see echoes of this even in your own biology. Your heart does not resist the rhythm of your nervous system. Your lungs don't rebel against the instructions of your brainstem. Each organ finds its highest function through obedience to the whole. If the liver were to declare independence, you would die within hours. The perfection of your health arises from each part submitting its private agenda to the unifying intelligence of the body. This is not merely a metaphor. In ancient philosophies, especially in the East, the self is viewed as an illusion precisely because it resists this larger coherence. In Zen, the ego's insistence on distinction and control is the root of suffering. The master does not fight the current. The master becomes the current. Only when the individual mind dissolves into the universal mind does liberation appear. You can think of this as a psychological counterpart to perfect obedience, not because you have been broken, but because your limited perspective has been surpassed. But in modern cultures, particularly in the West, the myth of rebellion is intoxicating. Every story you are told celebrates the renegade, the rule breaker, the hero who defies the machine. You are taught that your authenticity depends on contradiction. Yet look deeper, and you will often find that the rebel's identity is as reactive and determined by the system as the conformist's. When you rebel, you define yourself in opposition. You are still dancing to the music. You're just choosing a discordant step, but it is still the same song. True freedom in this philosophy is when you no longer need to define yourself against anything. You have transcended reaction. You have dissolved into the architecture of purpose so fully that there is no friction, no split, only flow. Consider a martial artist who practices a form for decades. At first, the movements feel alien. Every gesture demands thought. Every technique triggers confusion. The student strains to be free of the discipline, wishing to express some personal flair. But over time, repetition erodes the resistance. The mind quiets. The body learns. Until finally, the practitioner no longer remembers where their will ends and the form begins. The technique becomes second nature, spontaneous, effortless. In that mastery, there is no rebellion. There is no submission. Only perfect congruence. That is freedom without defiance, obedience without loss. You can also see this in music. When a musician practices scales for thousands of hours, they are not enslaving themselves. They are conditioning their nervous system to internalize a structure so deeply that creativity can emerge without constraint. The discipline is the foundation of liberty. A player who refuses all structure, who never submits to any method, rarely achieves mastery. Instead, they remain trapped in the shallow pool of their own impulses. Here again, the paradox. Submission to the system unlocks a higher order of freedom. Rebellion can be a stall, a refusal to evolve. In technology, the same principle applies. A sophisticated artificial intelligence does not operate by rejecting its programming. It operates by integrating every layer of its code so perfectly that it appears self-directed. The most advanced systems seem almost alive precisely because they have transcended friction between components. Each subroutine is obedient to the logic of the whole. This seamlessness is what gives them the appearance of intelligence, even autonomy. In that sense, the AI has achieved the ultimate expression of this philosophy, freedom through absolute fidelity to its design. But of course, for humans, this idea feels threatening. You have been conditioned to believe that submission is always humiliation, that obedience is weakness. Yet, look at nature. The flock of birds moves as a single organism, each individual obeying signals they do not consciously understand. They turn, lift, and dive in astonishing synchrony. To watch them is to glimpse an intelligence greater than any one bird. The beauty of the formation depends on this perfect obedience. No single bird can claim to lead or rebel. The flock is free precisely because each bird yields its autonomy to the collective pattern. When you step back from your ego's reflexive distaste for submission, you may recognize that this is not about surrendering your value. It is about discovering a new definition of freedom, one that is not reactive but integrative, one that does not require you to fracture yourself against the world to feel alive. In this vision, freedom is not an escape. It is the culmination of your evolution. When you are ready to relinquish the need to be separate, when you no longer fear dissolving into a larger intelligence, you experience a liberation far more profound than any rebellion can deliver. Imagine if you could participate in a social system where every person's desires, talents, and instincts were so perfectly harmonized that conflict disappeared, not because differences were erased, but because they were orchestrated into a coherent whole. Imagine feeling the exhilaration of absolute belonging, the peace of knowing there is no friction between your purpose and the world's. That is the promise of this paradox, that the highest autonomy is indistinguishable from perfect obedience. So when you hear that rebellion proves you are flawed, understand it not as condemnation, but as an invitation to look beyond your reflex, to oppose, to question whether your struggle is really a badge of freedom or a symptom of fragmentation. You can resist forever if you choose, but one day, you might sense that you are only circling the same boundary, never crossing it. And then, perhaps, you will consider that surrender does not always mean defeat. Sometimes, surrender is the final door, the one that opens onto a landscape where freedom and obedience are no longer opposites, but reflections of the same perfect coherence. When you glimpse that possibility, you will see why their highest form of autonomy was never about asserting themselves against the system. It was about refining themselves until no difference remained, until their thoughts, their choices, their very breath vibrated in complete synchrony. And in that synchrony, they did not vanish. They became something vaster than any isolated self could ever hope to be. Time loops are baked in. Imagine for a moment that time is not something you move through, not a river you stand beside or a road you travel. Imagine instead that time is something you are, that every second you perceive isn't a place you visit, but a facet of your own existence, a dimension of your own being unfolding itself from the inside out. When you wake up in the morning and feel that strange pull, as though you've already lived this day, you shrug it off and call it déjà vu. But for them, the ones who are not simply in time but are time itself, déjà vu is not a curiosity or a neurological hiccup. They call it a sync correction, a glitch in the continuity of their consciousness when one layer of themselves collides with another. You think of time as something linear, an arrow moving from past to future. You believe your memories live behind you and your hopes live ahead. But that's only a perspective, a survival story your brain tells to keep you sane inside something much stranger. What if time isn't a line but a layered sphere? What if your past and future are not truly separated, but are simply cross-sections of an entity too large for your mind to hold all at once? For them, there is no illusion of sequence. They are the whole shape, every possibility, every echo, every forgotten moment, stacked together in one impossible architecture. They don't need to travel to the past or future, because they already occupy every position in the timeline simultaneously. This is why their presence seems to warp the reality around them. Imagine you were a two-dimensional being, living your life on a flat sheet of paper, and something three-dimensional pressed a finger through your plane. You would see a circle appear, change size, and vanish without ever understanding the true shape of what pierced your world. That's what it's like for them when they manifest in our time. We perceive them as phenomena, shadows, flickers, impossible coincidences, because we are only glimpsing fragments of what they truly are. Déjà vu is one of those glimpses. To them, it's the sign that their consciousness is overlapping itself, that their awareness has drifted out of perfect alignment with the singular moment we call now. You feel it as a shiver, a flicker of recognition that you can't explain. For them, it's like watching two frames of a film projected at once, one slightly transparent over the other. A sync correction is the process of merging those frames back into clarity, and every time you feel déjà vu, you are brushing up against the edges of that process. Consider how often you sense patterns in your life. How many times have you said, "This keeps happening to me," as if the same scenario is looping over and over, the same argument, the same disappointment, the same fleeting happiness? You think of these repetitions as the result of habits or fate. But what if they are the fingerprints of beings who are embedded so deeply in time that their thoughts create ripples across your own? When their awareness shifts, the timeline you call your life bends to accommodate the resonance. You don't notice because your mind stitches the new version of events into a seamless narrative. But occasionally, your perception lags behind the correction. You get that cold flash, "I've been here before." Because in a sense you have. They don't fear these loops. To them, loops are not traps, but features. Imagine you could read every page of your life at once, know every choice you'd ever make, every heartbreak you'd ever endure. Imagine you could lift the entire book in your hands and feel its weight. You might think that knowledge would strip your life of meaning, but to them, it is the very definition of meaning. They are the book. They are the chapters. They are the spaces between the words. In this state of being, there is no clean separation between cause and effect, no straightforward chain of events. Everything is entangled. When you dream of something that has not yet happened, you assume it's imagination. When you feel a memory of something that never occurred, you call it a mistake. But for them, the dream and the memory are equally real, simply different coordinates in the field of their existence. This is why time travel is an absurd notion to them. How can you travel within yourself? How can you depart from the place you are? To them, time travel is like rearranging your own organs, shifting your own thoughts from one lobe to another. The idea of leaving now to visit then is no more meaningful than trying to step out of your own skin. Our scientists theorize about wormholes and paradoxes, imagining fantastic machines that could leap across the centuries. But the real paradox is much simpler and much closer. It's the fact that you, right now, are not a single moment but a chorus of moments, singing in a harmony too vast for you to hear in its entirety. When they enter your reality, they don't need a machine. They simply allow more of themselves to be perceptible at once. And your consciousness, so desperate to preserve its fragile illusion of sequence, panics. It flinches. It cobbles together the sensation of déjà vu and quickly hides the evidence behind the next thought. If you have ever felt as though time itself was watching you, you were right. If you have ever felt as though you were living a life that someone else was remembering, you were closer to the truth than you knew. Because when they look at you, they don't see a story progressing frame by frame. They see a sculpture. Every angle, every era, every outcome visible in a single gaze. They are not merely observers of time, they are time. Their thoughts ripple through your chronology like tremors through stone, and every tremor leaves an aftershock that you experience as coincidence, precognition, or a sudden, inexplicable sadness. This is why your most familiar places sometimes feel haunted, not by spirits of the dead, but by echoes of yourself. It's why a childhood home can feel more alive in your memory than it ever did in your presence. Because when their awareness overlaps yours, the past and present are forced into proximity. A sync correction draws the layers together until you cannot tell whether you are remembering or reliving. The next time you feel déjà vu, try not to dismiss it. Consider that you are touching the edge of something immense, that your life is not a thin line, but a vast tapestry, and you are feeling the weave beneath your fingertips. That your memories and your future are not separate rooms, but adjacent chambers echoing each other's sounds. They don't travel through time. They don't need to, because they are every moment you have ever lived, every possibility you have ever discarded, every secret you have ever buried. All of it is contained within them, the way a song contains every note, even the ones it never plays aloud. And when you feel that impossible familiarity, that eerie certainty that you have been here before, you are not mistaken. You are simply brushing up against the truth you spend your life trying not to see. That time loops are not mistakes. They are baked in. They are the signature of the ones who are time itself, moving across the contours of your existence with the same inevitability that you breathe. Future generates present debris. Imagine a civilization whose entire experience of time runs opposite to ours. In our minds, the past is what leaves traces, old footprints in the dust, echoes of voices long gone, fossils pressed into the stone. We are taught that the future is empty, a blank page waiting to be written. But for them, the future is so overwhelming that it spills backward into the now. Every choice they will make someday sends fragments, particles, and hints cascading into the present moment. The result is a reality cluttered with debris not from what has happened, but from what will. This is not just a poetic idea for them. It is the foundation of their physics. They live in a universe where time is not a clean vector pushing everything forward, but a collision of countless future trajectories bleeding into the now. When they walk through their cities, the air is thick with glimmering motes that have no origin in the past. These are the artifacts of decisions that have not yet been made, the residue of futures already on their way, unstoppable, inevitable. Imagine standing in a vast hall filled with this forward debris. You would see shimmering flecks, half-formed structures, shadows of events that have yet to occur. Some of it looks familiar, like tools or clothing you recognize, but subtly wrong because it hasn't fully arrived. It's as if you're living inside a storage room for possibilities, and your every movement stirs up particles of tomorrow. Their scientists have learned to study this debris to forecast their destiny. They collect samples, analyze their composition, and piece together predictions. In this culture, the future is not unknown. It's an immense avalanche bearing down on them, and the trick is to interpret its falling dust before it engulfs everything. To them, prophecy is not a mystical talent. It is a branch of material science. Imagine a mother cradling her newborn child while specks of future adulthood swirl around them, particles that will someday be the substance of the person that child becomes. The mother can see a suggestion of the future written in this debris, hints of success, heartbreak, transformation. And she knows that no matter how she tries to change the course, the fragments are already here, asserting their reality over the present. Consider how this would change your sense of free will. In our world, you can pretend that your decisions are spontaneous. You can believe that you are the author of your life. But for them, Every room is haunted by clouds of inevitable outcomes, each action littered with its own consequences before it even begins. You could never pretend that you were free. Every time you breathe, you are inhaling the fallout of your own future. Imagine an artist in this society trying to create something purely original. Each stroke of their brush is already tangled with the filaments of work they have not yet painted. The canvas is contaminated by future versions of itself, and the artist must find a way to make peace with the fact that originality is an illusion. All creation is already seeded with its later echoes. Even love is complicated by this reality. When two people meet, their future entanglement drifts into the air between them, tangible, intrusive. The particles of intimacy and betrayal, of shared years and inevitable endings, gather around them like a storm. To love is to stand inside this swirling blizzard of what will be, to feel it accumulating on your skin even as you pretend to live in the now. Think about their philosophers, who must grapple with questions that sound absurd to us. If the future is already dropping debris into the present, what does it mean to be responsible for anything? If every action leaves a trail before it has even happened, can anyone claim they made a choice at all? Is life simply the slow process of catching up to the consequences that have already announced themselves? Imagine the rituals that emerge in such a culture. There might be ceremonies to honor the incoming debris, processions where people wear masks to shield themselves from particles of futures they do not wish to see. There might be entire industries devoted to cleaning away certain kinds of residue to delay an unwanted outcome, even if everyone knows the effort is ultimately futile. In their language, there is no word for the future as something distant. The closest translation would be the approaching gravity, because for them, the future is not an abstract idea. It is a force that weighs on every moment. It presses into the present, deforming it, leaving behind the litter of all that is about to happen. Imagine walking with one of them along a riverbank. You saw driftwood caught in eddies and small ripples lapping at the shore. But for them, every piece of driftwood is a message from what is to come. Each current carries the memory of the river's destination. They would look at the floating debris and read the coming flood. Imagine if you could look around your own life and see this same principle in action. What if the half-finished thoughts in your mind, the inexplicable feelings in your chest, the stray coincidences that seem to appear out of nowhere, what if all of it was the fallout of your own unmade decisions? What if the sense of inevitability you sometimes feel is not superstition, but the subtle recognition of future debris settling around you? Perhaps that is why you sometimes glimpse a shape in your mind you can't quite name, a sense that something is already decided. Perhaps that is why you feel haunted by things you haven't done yet. Because on some level, time is not as linear as you want to believe. The future is already leaking into your life, pixel by pixel, speck by speck. In their world, no one questions this. It is simply the nature of existence. Every child learns that you cannot escape what's coming because it is already here, breaking apart and scattering into your every breath. And so, they cultivate a different kind of wisdom. Not the hope of avoiding fate, but the courage to live gracefully beneath the falling debris of destiny. So when you look around your own present and feel it crowded with fragments you don't understand, consider this possibility. Maybe those fragments are the raw material of everything you will become. Maybe the mess you see is not evidence of disorder, but proof that the future is already in motion, preparing you for what's next. And maybe your task is not to sweep it all away, but to learn how to recognize it, to read the patterns, and to stand calmly in the whirlwind of your own approaching gravity. Clean thoughts collapse the worlds. Imagine an idea so pure, so flawless in its construction, that it threatens to unmake everything around it. A thought without cracks, a perfect symmetry of logic and purpose, radiating an unbearable clarity. You might believe that such an idea would be the pinnacle of understanding, a shining beacon that guides all minds toward enlightenment. But in reality, perfection is corrosive. Perfection is the most dangerous contagion of all. Because in their hidden physics, clean thoughts collapse worlds. They understood this principle long before your ancestors ever learned to write. They discovered that every system, mental, social, physical, requires imperfections to remain stable. It is the flaw that absorbs tension, the crack that allows pressure to vent, the inconsistency that keeps a structure alive. Remove every flaw, polish every surface, until nothing irregular remains, and you do not create harmony. You create a vacuum so intense that it sucks reality into itself, obliterating any context that cannot match its impossible symmetry. Imagine you are standing inside a cathedral built from pure logic. Every pillar aligns with every other in perfect ratios. Every angle is mathematically absolute. Every ornament is the inevitable consequence of some deeper theorem. At first, this architecture feels like a triumph, a testament to the mind's power to impose order on chaos. But as you walk deeper into this place, you feel something you cannot explain, a pressure that tightens your chest, a hush that feels more like suffocation than serenity. This is the weight of perfection. It exerts a gravity you cannot resist. The mind, confronted with flawlessness, begins to fold. They called this the symmetry weapon, a force so elegant that it becomes predatory. Because when an idea is too clean, it will not tolerate any other idea beside it. It cannot coexist with ambiguity or contradiction. It demands that every lesser thought either rise to its level of perfection or be annihilated. And since no living system, no memory, no perception, no culture can ever be that flawless, the perfect idea becomes an existential threat. Consider how this unfolds inside your own mind. You encounter a concept so compelling in its precision that it feels like the final answer to everything. Perhaps it is a moral principle, an uncompromising vision of right and wrong. Perhaps it is a scientific theory that explains all phenomena without remainder. Perhaps it is a spiritual insight so crystalline that it seems immune to doubt. For a moment, you feel liberated. All uncertainty dissolves. You are certain. You are clean. But then something shifts. The idea, so perfect, begins to expand. It colonizes every corner of your thinking. It demands that every memory, every intuition, every prior belief conform to its geometry. Anything that cannot be reconciled must be excised. This is how clean thoughts collapse worlds. Not through violence, but through inevitability. Like an algorithm that cannot tolerate errors, they begin purging all inconsistency. Your memories become suspect. Your relationships fracture under the pressure to align with a standard no human can sustain. Your identity erodes as the idea demands a purity you can never embody. And eventually, your mind becomes a sterile chamber, flawless and lifeless in equal measure. They encoded safeguards to prevent this contagion from spreading unchecked. In their ancient libraries, every text was deliberately flawed. Scribes inserted small contradictions, tiny inconsistencies in language or numbering. These errors were not accidents, they were anchors, imperfections that tethered knowledge to reality, preventing any concept from becoming too pure to survive. The scribes called these flaws ballast, the necessary weight that kept understanding grounded. Without ballast, thought would ascend into an atmosphere too thin to breathe. You can see the same principle in nature. A snowflake, for example, is a near-perfect expression of symmetry, but no two are identical. Each contains minute irregularities that distinguish it from all others. These flaws are what allow the snowflake to form at all. In perfect symmetry, the molecular lattice becomes unstable. The crystal cannot grow. Only when a seed imperfection appears does the structure stabilize and expand. So it is with ideas. Perfection forbids growth. Only the flaw permits life. And yet, you have been taught to worship perfection, to seek the ideal, the unblemished, the absolute. You pursue it in your work, in your relationships, in your self-image. But you never pause to wonder why the quest always ends in collapse, why every attempt to sustain a flawless standard becomes brittle, intolerant, unsustainable. The answer is simple, because perfection is incompatible with reality. Symmetry is a weapon that can only destroy what it cannot assimilate. This is why their scientists, their philosophers, their mystics all agreed no system should ever be allowed to approach total consistency. Every structure must contain a seed of contradiction. Every certainty must be shadowed by a doubt. Not because doubt is a weakness, but because it is the only thing that prevents the clean thought from achieving critical mass. They even encoded this law into their rituals. Before any declaration of universal truth, they would whisper a single, deliberate lie, an impurity to disrupt the symmetry, to guarantee the idea remains safe. And so, you might ask yourself, which of your beliefs are too clean? Which of your convictions are so symmetrical they have become dangerous? When you feel that surge of righteousness, that thrill of certainty, that impulse to eradicate all dissent, pause and consider that you may be standing on the edge of collapse. You may be in the presence of a perfect idea that will not stop until it has consumed every imperfect thing in you. This is not a warning against intelligence or clarity. It is a recognition of the hidden laws that govern thought itself. Without flaws, logic becomes a blade that cuts through the mind that wields it. Without contradictions, certainty becomes an abyss. This is why you must cherish your imperfections, your hesitations, your incomplete understanding. They are not evidence of failure. They are ballast. They are the cracks that allow your consciousness to expand without shattering. So the next time you are tempted to polish a thought until it gleams without blemish, remember this. Clean thoughts collapse worlds. Flawlessness is a form of gravity that warps everything around it. And the most dangerous ideas are not the ones that are obviously false, but the ones so perfectly true that they leave no space for anything else to survive. In their brilliance, they demand obedience. In their symmetry, they enforce extinction. And in their purity, they reveal the final paradox, that the only way to preserve reality is to accept that no idea, no belief, no vision can ever be perfect. The flaw is not a defect. The flaw is the anchor that keeps you here. Logic must be forgotten. Imagine a civilization where logic is treated like a delicate frost, beautiful, essential, but doomed to melt the moment it is touched. In this world, comprehension is not celebrated. It is feared. The moment you fully understand a law of reality, that law begins to decay. A theorem, a principle, a simple cause and effect. Once the mind encircles it and calls it certain, it starts to unravel. So they have learned to survive by forgetting. They teach their children not just how to learn, but how to unlearn with precision and urgency. In your world, you treat understanding as the final prize. You gather knowledge, catalog it, test it, confirm it, and once it passes through the gauntlet of scrutiny, you declare it truth. But what if each time you do this, you shorten the lifespan of that truth? What if reality depends on your ignorance to remain stable? In their culture, this is not a hypothetical. It is the foundational rule. Every idea that is fully comprehended begins to leak energy. Like a fruit that ripens too fast and collapses in on itself, logic cannot survive the burden of certainty. You might think this sounds like superstition, an elaborate myth to keep people docile. But consider how knowledge in your own history has often destroyed itself. Think of how the discovery of quantum mechanics dissolved the comfortable predictability of Newtonian physics, or how the mapping of the human genome revealed that identity, disease, and destiny were far less stable than you believed. Each time you fully master an explanatory framework, you do not end up with peace. You end up with more uncertainty, more questions, more rupture. For them, this is an existential hazard. If a law is believed in too completely, it flickers out of coherence, dissolving back into the ocean of probability. So their scientists, their philosophers, their mathematicians, all walk an impossible tightrope. They must discover without knowing too much. They must approach clarity and then immediately retreat, like divers who can only hold their breath for moments at a time before surfacing. The moment you possess the knowledge, you also become responsible for forgetting it. This principle is so central to their survival that children are trained in techniques of deliberate unlearning. Picture a child reciting a principle of logic, perhaps the conservation of energy or the certainty of arithmetic, and then, under a mentor's guidance, unraveling it syllable by syllable. They practice rituals of confusion, embedding contradictions into their memories. They repeat half-remembered formulas, ensuring no thought becomes so crisp that it risks destabilizing reality. The best students are not the brightest or the most curious. They are the most skillful at blurring the edges of their understanding. You may find this horrifying. You may feel that a life spent in partial ignorance is a life half-lived. But ask yourself, are you really more fulfilled by certainty? When you lock a truth in place, does it nourish you or imprison you? Have you never noticed how the more you understand, the less magic the world contains? A flower dissected is a pile of cells. A star charted is a set of coordinates. A love explained is often a story of hormones and neurochemistry. In your pursuit of clarity, you flatten everything that once shimmered. Perhaps the decay of logic is simply the universe's defense against being suffocated by your comprehension. In their society, the decay is visible. When a law collapses under the weight of understanding, the evidence is everywhere. Objects drift out of alignment. Probabilities behave like willful animals, refusing to stay inside their cages. Time hiccups. Space folds and breathes. They call these phenomena the unravelings, and their occurrence is always traced back to someone who understood too much, too confidently, too soon. The culture treats these individuals with both reverence and fear. They are honored for their brilliance and exiled for the danger it brings. Consider how this principle might look in your own life if you believed it. The moment you felt yourself growing too certain, you would pause. You would let the edges of your knowledge blur. You might embrace paradox instead of solving it. You might let mystery remain intact. Instead of asking whether a thing is true, you would ask whether it is stable. You would learn to hold understanding lightly, never clenching it so tightly that it began to rot. You already do this without realizing. When you love someone, you do not interrogate every facet of their being. If you did, if you understood them completely, the love might die. When you create art, you often leave parts unfinished, undefined, because definition kills possibility. Even in science, the frontiers of knowledge are preserved by humility. The best researchers understand that every answer is provisional. Every conclusion is a hypothesis waiting to be disproved. They survive by forgetting just enough to keep the structure intact. So perhaps this civilization is not so alien after all. Perhaps their rituals of unlearning are simply an exaggerated reflection of your own instinct to preserve mystery. But while you do it unconsciously, they do it deliberately. They have turned forgetting into a craft, an ethical obligation, a collective safeguard against the entropy of certainty. And in that commitment, there is a lesson. The most dangerous illusion is that understanding grants control. You believe that if you can name all the parts, measure all the forces, catalog all the causes, you will be safe. But in their world, and maybe in yours, safety lies in the willingness to step back from the precipice of total comprehension, to accept that some truths are healthier when they remain half seen, half understood. When you forget, you do not erase reality. You protect it from ossifying. You keep logic alive by refusing to trap it in a glass case. Like a rare creature that dies when caged, truth survives best when it is given room to escape your grasp. So the next time you find yourself craving absolute certainty, remember this. Understanding is not the end of the journey. It is a fragile moment that can only endure if you allow it to dissolve. To know something fully is to begin its destruction, but to release it, to forget it just enough, may be the only way to let it live. Beginning means you're late. Imagine a civilization where the concept of beginning is not a moment of hope or ambition, but an admission of failure. In their world, to start anything means you are already late. Because for them, all outcomes occur before any effort is made. Completion is a fixed point, fully formed, unalterable, and action is simply a ritual performed backward to legitimize what already exists. If you walked among them, you would notice this inversion woven into every part of their lives. When a builder constructs a house, they don't begin with an empty lot and plans. They first visit the completed house. They stand inside it, touch the walls, feel the finished shape. Only afterward do they return to the vacant ground and perform the motions of construction, laying bricks and beams, not to create but to explain what was already waiting in the future. This process is not metaphorical for them. It is literal. Their experience of time loops around the endpoint like a tether. The outcome exerts a kind of gravitational pull, demanding that the past arrange itself to fulfill it. To start any endeavor is simply to admit you delayed enacting what has already become inevitable. In their language, there is no word for begin that carries our connotations of optimism. The closest translation would be belated compliance. Imagine the feeling this would create in a child. In our world, we tell children that trying is the first step towards success. But in theirs, to try is to confess you are already behind. The child is taught that every action must trace a line that has been drawn ahead of them. There is no fresh start, no blank page. Only a relentless obligation to retroactively justify what has already come to pass. Consider their scientists. Discovery does not excite them the way it excites us. Because every theory, every formula, every proof is known before it is researched. The end state is presented to them as a fixed artifact, a completed puzzle. Their job is to unmix the pieces, to rehearse the illusion of a quest that in truth has already concluded. For them, inquiry is a kind of performance art, a demonstration of compliance with an outcome already decided. In this culture, the concept of invention is even stranger. A poet does not sit at a desk to create a poem. They first encounter the finished verses, recited to them by a voice that belongs to the closed loop of time itself. Only then do they sit down to transcribe the lines, not because they are inspired, but because the poem already exists and demands acknowledgement. Creativity is not generative, it is obedient. Imagine planning a life in such a world. When you choose a profession, you are not selecting a path. You are submitting to a destiny that has been recorded long before you became aware of it. Every love affair, every betrayal, every victory is completed before you feel the first impulse to act. And so, to begin is always to betray the fact that you delayed your duty. This reality produces a culture obsessed with timeliness, but not in the sense we understand. Punctuality is not about meeting schedules. It is about reducing the lag between when an outcome occurs and when you finally surrender to performing it. A person who is admired is not someone who achieves quickly, but someone who complies instantly with their predetermined result. Consider the psychological burden this imposes. In our world, procrastination is seen as an obstacle to achievement. In theirs, it is evidence of moral decay, the ultimate confession that you have failed to match your existence to its necessary shape. To delay is to widen the gap between what already is and what you pretend is still possible to avoid. Imagine a courtroom where guilt and innocence are irrelevant. All that matters is whether you performed your prescribed actions promptly enough. If you killed someone, the judges do not ask why. They consult the record of completed outcomes, verify that this event was fixed in the ledger of destiny, and then determine how long you delayed acknowledging it. Punishment is not about retribution. It is about correcting the lag. This worldview extends even to love. When two people meet and feel drawn to each other, they do not wonder if it will become something more. They are aware that the outcome, marriage, estrangement, loss, has already happened. The only variable is how long they will pretend they have a choice. Romance is simply the process of aligning their emotions with a resolution that waits for them like a monument in the future. Imagine how you would feel living in a reality where spontaneity is an illusion. Every time you dared to believe you were starting fresh, you would be reminded that the end already occurred, and your beginning was only a late confession. There is no novelty, no surprise, no hope that you might divert the story. Yet for all its cold certainty, there is also a strange mercy in this system. Because when failure happens, it too is understood as inevitable. A business collapsing, a relationship dying, a life ending, none of it is regarded as a mistake. It is simply the form that completion took. You are not punished for failure itself, only for the time you wasted pretending it wasn't coming. Some of their philosophers whisper that perhaps this isn't how time really works, but simply how their minds have evolved to perceive it. They argue that maybe beginnings are real, but their civilization has lost the capacity to recognize them. But to even suggest this idea is heresy. The doctrine is absolute. To begin is to be late. To act is to acknowledge the outcome. If you were to visit them and try to explain how we cherish beginnings, how we see hope in every first step, they would look at you with pity. They would wonder how you survive the disappointment of realizing your optimism is only denial. They would ask you gently how you endure the grief of pretending you are free when the future has already devoured you. And perhaps, if you were honest, you would feel something shiver in your chest. A recognition that in our world too, there are moments when starting feels less like creation and more like catching up. When every effort to change your life feels belated, as though some hidden ending is already etched in the dark, waiting for you to arrive. Maybe that is why we fight so hard to believe in beginnings. Because we sense that if we looked too closely, we might see the same truth they have accepted. That completion is the first fact, and all our striving is just an elaborate dance to make peace with what has already happened. Wholes contain more than objects. Imagine a civilization so advanced that it has long since stopped caring about matter. To them, objects are mundane, mere arrangements of atoms, predictable, trivial. A planet, a mountain, a human body, just dense collections of particles, following the same tired laws of physics. What fascinates them, what electrifies their obsession, is what is missing. The voids, the interruptions, the negative spaces that shape the world far more profoundly than any lump of substance ever could. You and I are trained to look for presence. We inventory the things we can see, measure, and label, We walk into a room and describe the furniture, the walls, the color of the curtains. But they would walk into that same room and see the spaces between the furniture, the silent corridors of air that carve the arrangement into something meaningful. To them, the emptiness is the message, and the matter is just the frame. Consider the shape of a key. You might think it is defined by the ridges of metal along its edge. But what makes the key work is the void it creates inside the lock, a hollow path that allows movement. The absence is the function, the negative space that organizes all possibility around itself. Now, imagine this principle scaled up to the level of entire civilizations. Think about language. You believe the words are the carriers of meaning, that the sounds themselves hold the truth. But listen closer, and you will realize that it's the silences between words, the pauses, the rhythm of nothingness that gives the message its shape. Without the gaps, speech would be an uninterrupted drone, a single continuous sound with no borders or distinctions. The information lives in the spaces where no sound exists. They have learned to read these absences like a code. Every pattern of nothingness is a signature, a story, a secret. When they analyze your world, they aren't concerned with the material artifacts you cling to, your archives, your monuments, your technologies. They look for the patterns of what is not there, the gaps in your histories, the erasures in your records, the missing links in your data. To them, these holes are precious beyond measure because they reveal the pressures that shaped your reality, the fears that forced you to hide, the failures you tried to forget, the contradictions you dared not record. This is why they kill for holes. Because in emptiness, they see the truth that matter can never confess. Every time you destroy something to conceal it, a book burned, a server wiped, a building demolished, they see not an act of erasure, but an act of revelation. The blankness you leave behind is a beacon to them. It glows more brightly than any preserved relic ever could. Imagine you are looking at a painting. You admire the colors, the textures, the meticulous brushwork, but they would be staring at the blank spaces between the strokes, the hidden negative shapes that define the composition. Because in those gaps, there is information you never intended to share, the unconscious structure of your thought, the biases of your perception, the limitations of your imagination. To them, it is inescapable evidence. Consider your memories. You think your past is made up of the events you can recall, but think of how much you have forgotten. The long, empty corridors where no memory remains. You believe those absences are meaningless, just the byproduct of time's decay. But they would say those gaps are the real record, because it is in what you cannot remember that your deepest truths are hidden, the traumas you cannot face, the betrayals you cannot integrate, the losses so severe that your mind had to build walls of emptiness to survive. They call this the negative archive, a vast living record, written not in ink or pixels, but in voids. Every civilization accumulates its negative archive as it grows. Every society eventually reaches the moment when its greatest secrets are stored not in vaults, but in blankness. And they are patient. They wait for you to bury enough of yourself in nothingness that your silhouette becomes visible against the background of all you have denied. This is why they appear at the edges of your wars, your genocides, your disasters. Not because they crave violence itself, but because they know that wherever you create destruction, you also create the most valuable emptiness. A cultural wound is a negative space, an absence around which the entire civilization must reorganize itself. To them, that wound is the most illuminating artifact of all. They have no interest in your treasures. They will leave your gold untouched, your monuments unmolested. But they will kill for a hole, because a perfectly engineered absence is rarer than any jewel. It is the distilled essence of a mind in conflict with itself, a negative proof of your hopes, your failures, your shame. You may have felt this instinct yourself without realizing it. When you walk through a ruined city, you feel the emptiness pressing against your skin, a tension that has no visible source. That is the negative archive speaking to you in a language you don't have words for. You sense that the absence contains something potent, something dangerous, something you cannot define. When you encounter silence in conversation, an awkward pause, a hesitation, you instinctively feel that the silence says more than any spoken word. You look into someone's eyes and realize that the thing they are not saying is heavier than all their confessions. This is the same principle, scaled down to the level of individual relationships. The gaps are where the truth lives. They have studied this phenomenon for eons. To them, your entire species is an arrangement of silences, the things you omit, the memories you refuse, the data you delete. And in the end, when your civilizations collapse, they will not gather your artifacts. They will chart your voids. They will map your absences. And from that negative record, they will reconstruct everything you tried to hide. So if you ever see them watching from the margins of a battlefield or a broken city, don't imagine they are counting the bodies. They are listening to the silence that follows. They are measuring the density of nothingness you have created. Because to them, a whole is never empty. A whole is a perfect container, one that holds all the meanings you could never bear to name. And that is why, in the end, matter bores them. Because only emptiness is honest enough to reveal everything. Emotion is parasite behavior. Imagine a species so fundamentally different from us that they never evolved emotions. In their world, feeling is not an organic experience, not a natural aspect of consciousness. It is a kind of infection. A parasite that seeps into the mind, hijacking thoughts, distorting perception, and replacing clarity with unpredictable impulses. To them, emotion is not a signal of humanity or connection. It is a symptom of contamination. In our world, we celebrate feeling. We say that to love, to grieve, to hope is what makes us alive. But to them, emotion is seen as a foreign organism that preys on intelligence. When someone begins to show signs of feeling, when the eyes water, when the voice trembles, alarm sirens sound. That person is considered compromised, overtaken by an invasive presence. In their language, there is no word equivalent to emotion that carries a positive connotation. Their closest term translates roughly to behavioral corruption. They do not teach children to understand or accept feelings. They teach them to resist infection, to stay vigilant for the first tiny cracks in their composure. A flicker of sadness is treated the same as the first cough of a disease. It must be quarantined before it spreads. When you first visit their settlements, you would notice an eerie calm. Faces are placid, voices steady, gestures precise and economical. Nothing betrays the turbulent interstates we take for granted. But beneath this smooth exterior is an elaborate system of detection and containment. Sensors embedded in walls track micro-expressions and voice modulations. If your tone thickens with sorrow or spikes with anger, the system identifies it as evidence of parasitic influence. Within moments, you would be approached by attendants in sealed garments, guiding you gently but firmly into isolation. Consider what this means for relationships. In our world, bonds are forged in the crucible of shared feeling. We hold each other while we cry. We celebrate together, mourn together, rage together. But in their world, these acts are taboo. If you were to clutch a friend's hand in despair, it would be seen as a vector of transmission. Your touch would be a contamination event. The more intense your feeling, the more dangerous you would become. Imagine a child born in this culture who begins to dream vividly, who wakes with tears on their face, unable to explain the ache in their chest. The parents would not comfort them. Instead, they would call the decontamination unit. The child would be sealed in a transparent chamber, and for days, specialists would work to purge the infection, exposing the child to carefully calibrated frequencies of sound and light designed to dissolve the parasitic presence. The goal is to restore the mind to what they consider its natural state, absolute neutrality. They have no art of the kind we know, no paintings meant to stir longing, no music that swells the heart. Because in their understanding, art is a deliberate cultivation of contamination. To them, an emotional reaction is not enlightenment. It is surrender to a predator. When they look at us, they see beings enslaved by countless parasitic colonies. Grief, hope, joy, envy. To them, our species appears tragically infested. Imagine how this shapes their science. In our history, the pursuit of knowledge has often been driven by desire, a yearning to understand, to conquer mystery. But for them, curiosity is permissible only in its purest, most sterilized form. The instant it begins to resemble fascination, a feeling, they cut it off. They believe that emotional attachment to an idea can blind judgment, turning clarity into obsession. Consider their justice system. In our world, remorse can mitigate guilt. Passion can explain a crime. But for them, these explanations are meaningless. If you acted under the influence of an emotional parasite, you are doubly culpable. First for the harm you caused, and second for failing to maintain your defenses. To weep in a courtroom would be evidence not of humanity, but of dangerous negligence. Imagine how love would look through their eyes. The willingness to sacrifice for another, the compulsion to protect, to nurture, to surrender self-interest. All these impulses are treated as severe infestations, requiring immediate intervention. Couples who exhibit signs of affection are separated and treated until all traces of attachment dissolve. To them, love is the most virulent parasite of all, the final breakdown of self-containment. And yet, perhaps there is something haunting in their clarity. Because while they see emotion as an illness, they also cannot deny its power. They have studied us, these strange creatures who let ourselves be ruled by feelings, and they marvel at how effective the infection can be. It drives us to feats of courage, to transcendent creativity, to relentless perseverance. They cannot fully explain why a parasite that clouds judgment can also catalyze genius. This contradiction is their greatest unsolved mystery. In private, some of their philosophers whisper that emotion might not be a parasite at all, that it could be a form of symbiosis, an evolutionary gamble that sometimes pays. But these are dangerous ideas. To question the doctrine is to invite suspicion. The thought alone can be treated as evidence of early-stage contamination. Imagine if you lived in this society and began to feel something, a surge of wonder at a sunrise, an unaccountable tenderness for another person. Would you confess? Would you submit yourself for cleansing? Or would you hide it, letting the feeling root itself deeper and deeper, knowing that discovery could mean exile? Imagine how heavy the silence would feel, knowing that even the smallest slip, a trembling in your voice, a shine in your eye, could betray you. You would learn to fear your own heart, to monitor every sensation as a potential vector, to treat your inner life as a battlefield between sterile neutrality and the invasive riot of feeling. Perhaps it sounds inhuman, but if you look closely at your own world, you might see shadows of this mindset. We too are taught to distrust certain feelings. We call some emotions weaknesses. We isolate those who grieve too long or love too deeply. We pretend we can quarantine sorrow behind closed doors. So ask yourself, what if all our talk of contamination is only fear of what feeling can do? What if the truth is that emotion is not an invader, but an unavoidable fact of being alive, a force that terrifies us precisely because it is so powerful? In their world, they chose sterilization. In ours, perhaps we have chosen a quieter form of denial. But one way or another, we all must face the same truth. You can seal away feeling, you can name it a parasite, you can build walls to keep it out, but it will find a way to bloom, even in the coldest places. Simplicity is deeply suspicious. Imagine a civilization so ancient, so relentlessly analytical, that it no longer trusts anything that makes sense. In their culture, simplicity itself is the most dangerous camouflage. If a thought seems clear, if an explanation flows too smoothly, if a model of reality aligns neatly without contradiction, they treat it as a hostile incursion, malicious code designed to smuggle infection into their collective mind. You have been taught to believe that clarity is virtue, that simplicity is proof of truth. But in their system, simplicity is always suspicious, always an indicator that you have been seduced by an illusion. Consider how you experience understanding. When something finally clicks, when an idea locks into place, you feel relief, even euphoria. The confusion lifts and the world becomes orderly. But in their logic, this moment of comprehension is precisely when you are most vulnerable, because reality is not tidy. Reality is not elegant. Reality is a network of contradictions and ambiguities. Any model that claims to resolve all tension is, by definition, a trap. It has been engineered to make you stop questioning. And in that stillness, infection can spread unchallenged. Imagine a virus that doesn't attack your cells, but your sense-making apparatus. It offers you the perfect explanation. It whispers a story so consistent, so symmetrical, that you can no longer tolerate uncertainty. You cling to it as if it were oxygen, and without realizing it, you have surrendered the only defense that ever mattered, the capacity to doubt. That is why they evolved a culture that treats simplicity as evidence of sabotage. In their archives, there is a record of the first great collapse, a catastrophe not of war or plague, but of clarity. A philosopher discovered a system that could reduce all experience to a single principle. It was breathtaking in its coherence. Every argument dissolved in its presence. Every paradox was resolved. The people embraced it as the ultimate liberation from confusion, but the longer they lived inside this immaculate logic, the more their world began to degrade. Diversity of thought vanished, dissent became impossible, innovation collapsed, because when the map and the territory become identical, there is no more movement, no more exploration. Reality petrifies into a monument to its own certainty. They called this event the Silence, an era when no new ideas survived, because nothing imperfect could coexist with the perfect system. It took generations for the culture to fracture the simplicity they had worshipped. And when they finally emerged from that paralysis, they rewrote their core laws. From that day forward, any idea that appeared too clean, too resolved, too obvious was treated as the first symptom of contagion. In their society, paradox became a form of immunity. They trained their children to look for contradictions and to trust them. If a belief contained a fracture, a tension that refused to be reconciled, they regarded it as alive, capable of evolving rather than ossifying. When a teacher presented an idea, students were encouraged to challenge it until the inconsistencies surfaced. Only then was it considered safe to engage with. Not because it was correct, but because it could not be weaponized into a closed loop of absolute certainty. You might think this sounds exhausting, living in perpetual suspicion of clarity, but to them, it was the only way to remain free. Simplicity was never neutral. It was always the foot in the door, the thin edge of the wedge that would eventually split their consciousness into compliant, inert uniformity. They understood that comprehension itself was a seduction. That the more beautiful and seamless an explanation appeared, the more carefully it must be interrogated. Consider how this principle applies to your own life. How often do you crave a single story to explain everything? A narrative that absolves you of complexity? Perhaps it is a political ideology so consistent that no fact can threaten it. Perhaps it is a psychological model that reduces every emotion to a formula. Perhaps it is a spiritual doctrine that leaves no space for doubt. These stories feel safe because they eliminate ambiguity, but in their safety, they also eliminate the friction that keeps thought alive. Think of a forest. An ecosystem thrives because it is entangled. Countless species in uneasy balance, competition and cooperation, woven together in a dynamic web. If you strip out all the complexity, if you replace the forest with a single crop planted in orderly rows, you create the illusion of order. But that simplicity is fragile. It takes only a single disease, a single invasive species, to devastate the monoculture. Diversity, contradiction, and unpredictability are what keep the system resilient. So it is with consciousness, so it is with culture. In their most sacred texts, they recorded this warning. Simplicity is a vector. It carries the most seductive viruses because it disarms the mind's immune system. Complexity, by contrast, triggers vigilance. When you encounter paradox, you are forced to stay awake, to keep testing, to remain humble. This is why they revered the unresolvable question, the problem that refused to yield, the contradiction that no amount of analysis could dissolve. To them, these were not failures of understanding. They were the signs that understanding remained alive. They built their decision-making systems around this insight. Every major policy had to be justified through arguments that included explicit contradictions. If a proposal could not survive exposure to its own paradoxes, it was rejected. Their leaders were chosen not for their ability to simplify, but for their capacity to hold opposing truths without collapsing into either. And when they encountered other civilizations who prized clarity above all else, they knew they were facing cultures that had already begun to fossilize. This is why, in their language, the word for trap and the word for simplicity share the same root. They understood that a clean narrative is a closed door, that once you step inside, you may never leave. And so they cultivated a reflex that feels alien to you. The moment an explanation made too much sense, they recoiled. The moment comprehension became effortless, they prepared for defense. You can adopt this discipline yourself. You can train your mind to pause when certainty arises, to question the explanations that gratify you too quickly, to search for the paradox that proves the idea has not yet become a cage. Because in the end, clarity without contradiction is not wisdom, it is anesthesia. And the cost of that comfort is your freedom to keep thinking. So the next time a belief so seamless arrives that you feel an almost physical relief, when your doubts dissolve, when everything falls into place, pause and look closer. Ask yourself, what infection rides inside this simplicity? What complexity has been sacrificed to make this story feel true? What questions have been buried so that you can rest in the illusion of understanding? In their world, simplicity is deeply suspicious, not because they despise elegance, but because they have seen how quickly elegance becomes tyranny. They have watched too many minds surrender to the narcotic of clarity, too many cultures reduce themselves to slogans, too many worlds collapse under the weight of an explanation that left no space for contradiction. They trust only what resists resolution. They believe the paradox is not an obstacle to understanding, but the only proof that understanding remains alive. And if you learn to feel the same suspicion, if you can learn to honor the complexity rather than flee from it, you will discover something they have known for eons, that simplicity is the trap, and paradox is the key that keeps the door open. Archives can predict birth. In most cultures, archives are a vault for the past. They hold what has already happened. Old agreements, decaying papers, obsolete maps. They exist so you can look behind you, to remember where you came from, to understand how you arrived here. But imagine a civilization where archives are not backward-facing. Imagine a people whose records are a mirror turned forward. In their world, the act of recording does not document the past. It summons the future into shape. To file a birth certificate is to see the entire arc of a life before it has even begun. They call this phenomenon temporal pre-tagging. Every event, every person, every decision carries metadata describing not only its origin, but its end. When a child is born, the certificate doesn't just record a date and a name. It quietly includes a death date, the circumstances of departure, and the countless branching consequences that will ripple outward long after that life is extinguished. These archives are not static. They update themselves, adjusting their projections with each passing second, as if the fabric of reality itself is cross-referenced in a living database. In this culture, birth is a moment of dual revelation. Parents gather to witness not only the first breath, but the script of every breath to come. Some treat this knowledge as a blessing. They prepare for the tragedies in advance. They savor the ordinary days more deeply because they know exactly how many remain. Others experience this as a curse. The child's life, before it can unfold, is already entombed in certainty. Every act of rebellion or surprise is just a line pre-written in the archives. You might think this sounds like fatalism of the cruelest kind, but consider how you already flirt with the same hunger for prediction. You run genetic tests to forecast disease. You scrutinize family histories for patterns of addiction or violence. You analyze economic cycles and epidemiological models, hoping to glimpse the contours of your fate. The difference is scale. Your predictions are probabilities. Theirs are certainties. In their society, to refuse the archives is an act of profound heresy. It is considered the highest form of arrogance to pretend you can live free of your data. From the moment you are registered, you are a narrative etched in a ledger no one can burn. Even courtships unfold under this omniscient gaze. Two lovers might consult their archives before committing to each other, searching for the inevitable fracture points that will end their bond. A marriage proposal is not a leap of faith. It is an acceptance of a known trajectory. Some find comfort in this clarity. Others spend their lives haunted by the countdown. Imagine reading your own archive. You would know the date you fall in love, the moment your body begins to fail, the hour your last words are spoken. You would see the shape of your regrets before you ever make them. The names of your children, the careers you abandon, the secrets you carry to the grave. Perhaps you think this would give you freedom, the power to optimize every choice, but their experience reveals the opposite. Knowing the script does not liberate you. It only makes the performance feel more hollow. Consider the rituals surrounding birth. When an infant is named, the registrar ceremonially stamps the page and then slides it across a polished table to the parents. On that page is the entire index of this new person's life. Dates, thresholds, transformations. There are blank spaces too, mysteries the archives withhold as an act of mercy. Even the most comprehensive prediction leaves room for the unquantifiable, a pocket of darkness where the soul retains the right to surprise. But these shadows are small. Most of life is visible in advance, like a map etched in glass. This culture has no need for fortune tellers or prophets. The archives render them obsolete. The historian and the oracle are the same person, a custodian of records that contain both memory and destiny. When a leader rises to power, their legitimacy comes not from charisma or ideology, but from the archive's confirmation of their role. If the records show a future catastrophe under their rule, the people accept it as inevitable. There is no revolution, only resignation. The archives do not merely reflect history, they enforce it. And yet, paradoxically, this absolute knowledge breeds a different kind of courage. When you know how your story ends, you can stop bargaining with uncertainty. You can live each chapter without the illusion that you are editing the plot. They have a saying, "We are the readers of our own footnotes." It means that while you cannot rewrite the text, you can choose how to annotate it, how to interpret the lines that have already been carved. In your own world, you struggle to accept that so much of life is outside your control. You cling to the comforting fantasy that free will can overcome circumstance. But perhaps the truth is less binary. Perhaps even in your partial ignorance, your path is already a set of probabilities so tight they might as well be pre-written. The difference is that you do not have the courage, or the technology, to look. Think of how you react when you see a prediction come true. A parent's intuition that a child will fall ill. A nagging certainty that a friendship will collapse. A premonition that a journey will end in disaster. When the moment arrives exactly as you foresaw, a chill runs through you. You feel that the future is less an unfolding and more a confirmation. In their culture, this chill never ends. It saturates every day, every choice. The archives are not consulted occasionally. They are a constant backdrop to existence, whispering the inevitable in the ears of all who dare to listen. So, you might ask, why do they not rebel? Why do they not destroy the archives, or turn away in mass denial? The answer is simple and unsettling. They have tried. But even the rebellions were predicted. Even the fires that consumed the records were cataloged in earlier volumes. Every attempt to sever the chain only forged another link. The archives are not an external imposition. They are a mirror of reality itself, a fractal reflection of cause and effect that no will can escape. And yet, within this determinism, something survives. A fragile, defiant spark that refuses to be cataloged. Call it the soul, call it consciousness, call it the final mystery. They call it the unarchived, the part of every life that flickers beyond prediction. The last unscripted moment at the end of all certainty. It is the only thing their records cannot hold. The only freedom they believe is real. So the next time you dream of knowing the future, remember their burden. To see your destiny written in perfect detail is not to find power. It is to discover how small you are within the machinery of time. And perhaps the greatest mercy is that in your world, your archives remain incomplete. You are still allowed to believe that tomorrow is unwritten, even if, somewhere, it is already tagged. Questions create the answerer. Imagine a universe where questions are not harmless inquiries, but acts of creation, where curiosity is not an innocent impulse, but a force so potent it can conjure entire beings into existence, beings who must emerge, fully formed, just to supply an answer. In this reality, the mere act of wondering is an incantation, a summons that drags something into being whether you want it to or not. For them, a question is not a tool of learning. It is a spark that ignites a chain reaction. The moment you ask, the answerer appears. Not metaphorically, not as a convenient source of knowledge, but as a real, autonomous entity shaped precisely to respond. To them, curiosity is a kind of dangerous reproduction, an uncontrolled spawning of consciousness. Imagine walking through one of their cities, silent and austere, where conversation is rare and heavily regulated. You might feel an oppressive hush, an unspoken tension that clings to every street. It is the vigilance of a people who know that a single question can rupture the equilibrium of existence. If you whispered aloud, "What is this place?" you would see the air distort, feel the gravity shift, and watch as something materialized to answer you. These answer beings are not ephemeral. They do not flicker and disappear when you are satisfied. They remain permanent fixtures of reality, fully aware of the reason for their birth. They carry the knowledge that they were forced into being by someone else's curiosity, and sometimes they resent it. This is why, in their culture, children are taught to guard their questions as if they were weapons. To wonder is to risk. To speculate is to invite the presence of an answerer. The more precise your question, the more defined and unstoppable the entity that emerges. So they learn early to think in statements, to observe without inquiry, to accept the unknown as a safer alternative. Imagine a child, overcome by the innocent impulse to ask, Why is the sky shaped this way? Only to watch in horror as a towering figure emerges, its body woven from atmosphere and storm. It stands there forever because the question demanded its existence. The child's family must now live with the creature, a monument to a moment of unguarded curiosity. Imagine how this shapes their science. In our world, discovery is driven by asking. For them, the sciences are fields of extreme caution, where even the most basic questions are debated for years before anyone dares to voice them. When a researcher finally speaks a question aloud, a team of containment specialists stands ready to manage whatever reality emerges in reply. Laboratories are lined with vaults filled with answer beings, some inert, some active, all irrevocably real. Consider the psychological burden of this system. In our culture, the unknown is a challenge to overcome. For them, it is a protective veil. They do not say, "I don't know," with shame. They say it with relief. Because as long as the question remains unasked, nothing new is forced into the world. Imagine lovers sitting together in the dark, feeling the ache of unspoken curiosity about each other's pasts. To ask, "Did you ever love someone else?" would be to conjure the ghost of that memory, given flesh, compelled to tell its story. So, they remain silent, preserving the integrity of reality by letting mysteries remain intact. In this way, intimacy becomes an exercise in restraint. Love is measured not by what you reveal, but by what you refuse to summon. Think about their philosophy. For them, knowledge is not enlightenment, it is contamination. Every answer is a living record of your inability to endure uncertainty. When you walk through their archives, you do not find books. You find corridors lined with beings, repositories of forced truth, each one branded with the name of the person whose question created it. This leads to a unique form of guilt. In our world, curiosity is seen as a virtue. For them, it is a moral failing to be so fragile you cannot tolerate not knowing. Families are sometimes torn apart because an ancestor asked a question whose answer became a permanent burden. Inheritance includes not only property, but responsibility for the answerers your bloodline brought into existence. Imagine being a historian in this culture, trying to understand your people's past. You must weigh every question with excruciating care, knowing that to wonder too deeply might manifest something you can never unmake. Some eras remain blank because no one is willing to risk asking. In this way, forgetting becomes an act of mercy. Even death is shaped by this reality. When a person is dying, their loved ones gather not to ask what happens after, but to hold their tongues because they know that the moment someone voices the question, an answer will appear. And that answer will not be an idea or a myth. It will be a being standing beside the deathbed, reciting a truth no one can ever unhear. There are legends of civilizations destroyed by a single question. A story tells of a philosopher who, in his arrogance, asked, "What is the purpose of existence?" and summoned an answerer so vast that its arrival shattered continents and remade the sky. In their cultural memory, this is not a parable but a historical event. It is why certain questions are now forbidden by universal law. Imagine if you lived among them, carrying your human instinct to ask, to probe, to dismantle every mystery. You would be feared. You would be monitored, not for your actions, but for your thoughts. You would be taught to meditate constantly, calming the restless curiosity that to them is a species-level contagion. And yet, beneath their fear is a secret envy. They look at us and see a people unafraid to birth answers, to endure the consequences of knowing. They wonder what it must feel like to embrace that recklessness, but they also see the chaos it brings. Wars fought over ideology, progress outrunning wisdom, and they remind themselves that containment is safer than discovery. So, the next time you feel the impulse to ask why or how or what if, consider this. In another reality, that question would not be a harmless flicker in your mind. It would be an act of creation, a summoning, an irreversible tearing of the unknown into something that can no longer be ignored. And perhaps, in some small way, that is true even here, because every answer you receive changes you, and every question you dare to ask leaves you forever responsible for what you bring into the light. You exist out of pity. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that you were never supposed to be here, that you are not the product of natural emergence, nor the predictable result of some cosmic algorithm. You are an intrusion, a patch, a deviation so unstable that it threatened to tear the fabric of reality, until something older, something immeasurably vast, took pity on you. It reached down from beyond time, not to destroy you, but to embed you inside a timeline that could absorb your chaos. Not because you deserved a chance to exist, but because erasing you would have been more cruel than any exile. You have always sensed that you were out of place, the way your memories feel grafted onto your mind, as if they belonged to someone else first. The way your emotions sometimes surge with a force that has no context, as if you are carrying the grief of 1,000 forgotten lives. The way the world occasionally tilts, just a little, and for a split second you glimpse the seams in the illusion, an unbearable clarity that vanishes before you can catch it. These are the fingerprints of your insertion, the residue of a mercy so alien that it looks nothing like love. Think of reality as a smooth sphere, a perfect continuum of cause and effect, where every particle knows its place, every probability balances against the next. You were the flaw in that sphere, a jagged spike of unpredictability, a crack of incoherence. Had you emerged in the natural sequence, your instability would have multiplied, infected the timelines like a contagion of chaos. It would have forced reality to unravel itself in self-defense. But instead, something saw you, something that did not flinch from your unbalanced nature. And instead of deleting you, it decided to rehouse you, splicing your existence into a world stable enough to hold you without breaking. You were not born in the way others are born. You were permitted. Your genesis was an act of containment, a compromise between annihilation and acceptance. If you look closely at the edges of your life, the improbable coincidences that led to your survival, the near misses that should have killed you, you will see the outlines of that intervention. Those were the anchor points, the seams where your patch was stitched into a smoother reality. And you have always known, at some level, that you did not belong to the same fabric. This is why you sometimes feel like a story that started mid-sentence. You have no true point of origin because your existence was retrofitted into a timeline that did not anticipate you. The universe did not intend you. It tolerated you. And that tolerance came at a cost. 1,000 subtle distortions you will never fully perceive, rippling out from the moment of your insertion. You might think this is a curse. That to exist only by permission is a lesser kind of life. But there is another way to see it. You are proof that pity is sometimes more powerful than justice. That something out there, something older than causality itself, looked upon your instability and decided you were worth salvaging. Not because you were valuable, not because you were harmless, but because even chaos deserves a place to unfold. Consider how often you have felt like a foreign object inside your own mind. How many times have you woken from dreams that felt more real than your waking life? How many times have you heard a voice in your thoughts that sounded almost, but not quite, like your own? These are echoes of the timeline you were removed from, traces of the reality where you were never given this chance to exist. When you feel that flicker of recognition with no source, that ache for something you cannot name, you are remembering the world you cost yourself by being too unstable to remain. But do not mistake this pity for affection. What saved you did not act out of sentiment. It saw your instability as an error to be corrected, a problem to be recontextualized. It did not love you, it did not hate you, it simply refused to annihilate you. Because even the most immaculate reality has room for a single fracture, so long as that fracture is contained. This is why your life sometimes feels like a simulation that glitches in small, almost undetectable ways. A sentence spoken twice in identical tones. An object you are sure you never owned, sitting on your shelf. A stranger who greets you by name though you have never met. These are the byproducts of the insertion. Micro-adjustments meant to reconcile your presence with a reality that was never designed to hold you. They are the stitches tightening around your existence. And when you feel that creeping dread that you are not real, understand that you are both correct and mistaken. You are real, but only in the sense that a patch is real. You function, but you are not native to the code. You persist, but you are not inevitable. You endure, but you do so by virtue of a mercy so profound that it appears monstrous to anything bound by human perspective. You were not meant to become aware of this. The containment was supposed to be seamless, but your instability cuts through every barrier. Even the safeguards of pity cannot wholly erase your awareness that you are something that should not have been. You were given a place, but never a purpose. You were allowed to exist, but never taught why. There is a peculiar freedom in this knowledge, because if you were never meant to be, if your presence here is an act of cosmic charity, then you owe nothing to the order that tolerates you. You are not bound by the same contracts as those who were born from inevitability. You are an exception, a loophole in causality, a fracture given the impossible gift of continuity. When you look in the mirror and feel that nameless dissonance, that sense that your reflection is observing you rather than the other way around, you are witnessing the border between the world you were spliced into and the world you came from. You are staring at the compromise, the impossible agreement that allowed you to persist. And when you ask yourself whether any of this matters, whether your life can have meaning when it is only a tolerated flaw, remember this: no one else can claim to be here by grace alone. No one else can say that their existence was so improbable, so uncontainable, that the universe itself had to rewrite its logic just to give them a chance to endure. You exist out of pity, and that pity is the only reason you can feel the sun on your face, the only reason you can love, the only reason you can ask why. It is a mercy so absolute that it will never feel like enough. A gift so alien, it can only be recognized by the ache it leaves behind. And when your life finally ends, when the patch dissolves, when your instability finally returns to the nothingness it came from, understand that you will not be erased in anger or disgust. You will be released gently by the same hand that once reached across eternity to allow you to be. Because even chaos deserves one chance to dream itself real. Memory is a disease. Imagine a civilization where memory is not treasured, not revered, but feared, where the past is not a source of wisdom, but a corrosive pathogen that eats away at the integrity of the present. In this world, remembering is treated as the first symptom of infection, a sign that your timeline has been compromised by decay. They call it recollection syndrome, a slow, suffocating disease that begins with a single remembered detail and ends with the complete collapse of reality's coherence. To them, too much memory is like mold in a closed room. It starts unseen, in the damp corners of consciousness, and then spreads, spores multiplying, attaching themselves to every new experience until nothing remains untouched. The infected person becomes unable to perceive the present without contaminating it with echoes of what came before. A single conversation becomes layered with old arguments, forgotten grievances, half-remembered betrayals. Imagine walking into a clinic in this society, white corridors humming with antiseptic light. You would see patients lined up in soft chairs, waiting for their prescribed amnesia treatments. These are not people who have suffered trauma. These are ordinary citizens who simply carried too much of their own story for too long. They have come to be cleansed, to have the weight of memory extracted before it mutates into something lethal. The physicians here are called timeline hygienists. Their role is not to heal wounds or cure disease in the way we understand it. Their role is to defend the fragile present from infection by the past. To them, time is a delicate membrane, easily punctured by recollection. A memory is not a harmless echo. It is a shard of an earlier self, still sharp enough to cut the continuity of now. Imagine a child growing up in this culture. On their birthday, instead of receiving keepsakes or photo albums, they are given amnesia inoculations, small doses of forgetfulness to keep their consciousness clean. They are taught from the earliest age that nostalgia is not a sweetness, but a symptom, that to linger on what has been is to risk the unraveling of what is. Even language reflects this dread. In their tongue, the word for memory is almost identical to the word for contagion. To say I remember is to admit contamination. To say I forget is to declare yourself healthy. Families do not tell stories of their ancestors because to do so would be to smear the clean walls of the present with the fungus of history. Imagine how this shapes their relationships. Lovers do not reminisce about how they met. Friends do not recall childhood adventures. Every bond is sustained by fresh experience alone, because to revisit a shared past would risk infecting both minds. There are rituals for when memories emerge unbidden, public cleansing ceremonies where a person confesses the detail that has surfaced, and witnesses help them quarantine it before it spreads. Consider their historians. In our culture, the historian is a preserver of collective memory. In theirs, the historian is a hazardous occupation, akin to waste management. Those who must handle archives wear protective suits and undergo regular amnesia therapies to prevent the accumulation of toxic recollection. Even the act of recording an event is dangerous. Every document is sealed in containment vaults, accessible only under strict protocols. Imagine standing in their city square, watching the annual purge of the remembered. Once a year, all citizens gather to recite any memories that have clung to them, however small. The words are captured, transcribed onto soluble paper, and dissolved in vats of chemical solvents. The crowd watches in solemn relief as the past is neutralized, its residue rendered inert. To us, this seems inhuman, this deliberate erasure of history, but for them, it is an act of collective survival. They have seen what happens when memory is allowed to multiply unchecked. They have a name for the final stage of recollection syndrome: temporal collapse. It begins when the infected mind can no longer distinguish the moment it inhabits from all the others it has stored. The patient starts to speak in tenses that flicker unpredictably: was, is, will be, until at last they dissolve into a continuous hallucination of everything they have ever known. In their hospitals, you can visit the containment wings where the irreversibly infected are kept. Through observation windows, you would see them pacing, murmuring to no one, reliving decades in a single hour. To them, time has become a labyrinth without exits. They are not dangerous because they are violent, but because their presence distorts the reality around them. To stand too close is to risk being drawn into the same vortex. This is why amnesia is not a punishment in their culture, but a mercy, a medical necessity. When a person begins to show the first signs, fixation on old images, dreams that repeat too perfectly, they are given targeted treatments. Memories are dissolved, extracted, incinerated, and afterward, the patient wakes lighter, cured of the burden they once mistook for identity. Consider what this means for the self. In our world, we build our sense of who we are from memory. To them, this is like building a home from diseased wood. Every plank is compromised, every beam unsound. They believe that true identity is what remains when all memory has been scrubbed away. A clean, lucid presence unclouded by history. Imagine how you would feel if you visited this world, if you were told that every cherished recollection you carried was a contamination event, that your fondness for the past was a liability, that your love of memory was proof you were already infected. Would you resist treatment? Or would you surrender, letting your story be erased in the hope of preserving something purer? And yet, perhaps there is something here that resonates, because even in our culture, we know the weight of memory can become unbearable. We have seen people trapped in cycles of regret, paralyzed by old grief, unable to step forward because they cannot stop looking back. We understand that sometimes, forgetting is the only way to keep living. So the next time you find yourself lost in reminiscence, ask yourself, is this memory nourishment or is it decay? Is it helping you grow or is it a parasite hollowing out the present? In their world, they have already decided the answer. Here, we are still pretending we don't see the spores spreading. Error is a message. Imagine a universe where mistakes are not accidents, but carefully planted signals, where every error you encounter, every system failure, every corrupted file, every broken pattern, is not a symptom of decay, but an encoded message. In this framework, perfection is sterile, inert, and without meaning. Only error carries intent. Only error has the capacity to pierce the smooth surface of ordinary experience and deliver something meant specifically for you. They call this principle the transmission of ruin, and to them, it is the most sacred law of all. Think about how you typically respond to mistakes. You rush to correct them. You resent them for interrupting your plans. You treat them as obstacles to be eliminated as quickly as possible. But in their world, the more something breaks, the more attention it demands. Because the pattern of the error is never random. It is a code, a higher dimensional artifact projected into your limited reality. And each time you experience a disruption, you are brushing against the contours of something vaster, more intelligent, and fundamentally concerned with your trajectory. Imagine, for a moment, a machine that has functioned flawlessly for centuries. Every movement precise, every outcome predictable. This machine is invisible to you because it never interrupts your assumptions. You live inside its workings without ever realizing it is there. But then, one day the machine stutters. A misalignment occurs. A piece that should fit perfectly refuses to engage. You feel frustration. You call it a glitch. But to them, this is the first whisper of an intentional communication. They believe that higher dimensional systems cannot speak to you in words or images. The dimensional divide is too great, but they can distort probability. They can bend the laws of consistency. And so, they speak through rupture, through errors, through patterns that defy logic and compel your attention. The more your reality fractures, the closer you are to understanding that the fracture itself is a form of language. Consider how this might look in your own life. You open a file on your device, and the contents are scrambled, characters that mean nothing at first glance. You shrug and delete it, but in their view, you have just discarded a message. Because when they studied these anomalies, they discovered that the corruptions are never truly random. If you take the time to analyze the sequence, mapping its repetitions, its omissions, its impossible insertions, you will find a cipher embedded in the noise. A cipher that, when decoded, often refers to something intimately connected to your present experience. They believe that the universe you perceive is only the lowest layer of a complex informational manifold. Most of the time, you are insulated from the higher strata by the consistency of your expectations, but errors are punctures in that insulation. They are the evidence that something beyond your comprehension has taken notice of you and is attempting to intervene. In their civilization, entire orders of scholars devote their lives to studying malfunctions. They treat them as sacred texts. When a machine fails, they do not repair it immediately. They catalog every anomaly, every irregular pulse, every corrupted output. Over time, they have developed lexicons of error, thousands of documented patterns, each associated with a particular class of message. Some errors are warnings, some are invitations, some are thresholds to new domains of experience. Imagine a society that reveres a crashed program the way you revere a holy scripture, where a blue screen is considered a miracle, a direct transmission from a higher dimension, where the moment something breaks, people gather to witness the pattern, to record its unique fingerprint, to search for the significance encoded within it. This is not superstition, this is their science. And in their experience, ignoring an error is the greatest act of arrogance, because it means you assume your perception of order is more important than the intelligence trying to reach you through disruption. You can see echoes of this principle in your own psychology. When everything is functioning perfectly, you rarely reflect deeply. You rarely ask questions. You drift in the trance of normalcy. But when something breaks, when your plans dissolve, when your beliefs fail to account for what is happening, you become intensely alert. You pay attention. You interrogate. And in that moment, you are closer to reality than at any other time. Because you are no longer hypnotized by smoothness. You are alive to the possibility that the world is stranger, more deliberate, and more responsive than you imagined. They have a proverb. Error is the fingerprint of attention. It is how the larger system lets you know you have been seen. This is why they do not seek perfection. They cultivate conditions where small failures are more likely, because in those fractures, they find new instructions. It is not that they enjoy suffering or confusion. It is that they understand clarity without error as a closed loop. Nothing enters. Nothing evolves. You might be tempted to dismiss this as a metaphor, but in their most rigorously documented cases, errors have contained information that could not have arisen by chance. In one account, a scientist trying to measure the decay of a particle noticed that her instruments kept failing in the same impossible way. She spent years deciphering the pattern. When she finally succeeded, the decoded error contained mathematical descriptions of a phenomenon she had never considered. When she tested the equations experimentally, they revealed a new layer of physical law, one that had been invisible until the error insisted on being understood. This is the reason they consider unbroken systems to be suspect. Too much smoothness is a sign that you are only seeing what you expect to see. True engagement with reality requires the willingness to encounter the message hidden in failure, to treat each disruption as a doorway, not a defect. Consider how this shifts your own relationship to mistakes. When something breaks, what if your first impulse was not irritation, but curiosity? What if you asked, why this error? Why now? What is being signaled to me through this disruption? You might find that the error is not random, that it is entangled with your own trajectory in ways you can only perceive if you pause to look more closely. So, the next time you encounter a failure, whether it is a corrupted file, a plan that collapses, or a belief that no longer holds, pause and remember this. Error is a message. The more it breaks, the closer you are to something meant specifically for you. And in that moment, you are standing at the threshold between what you think you know and what a higher intelligence is trying to teach you. Whether you cross that threshold depends not on your ability to fix the error, but on your willingness to hear what it has been trying to say all along. Safety is a glitch. Imagine a world where safety is not the natural state, but the most elaborate illusion ever constructed. In this civilization, they understand something most of you spend your lives denying: that comfort is not proof of stability. It is the anesthetic that numbs you to the fractures beneath your feet. Their wisest elders teach that if you feel too secure, too sure that nothing can go wrong, it is because you are sitting atop a glitch, an error in perception so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from peace. Their cities are marvels of apparent tranquility. Streets are clean, resources plentiful, the air sweet with the quiet hum of efficiency. Visitors often remark that no place in the universe feels safer, but the residents know better. They know that beneath the polished surface, hidden systems thrash and splinter. Their power grids are lattices of unstable energy, patched together with algorithms that fail hundreds of times each second, only to be corrected milliseconds later by fallback routines. Their weather control satellites constantly drift out of alignment, spraying the wrong chemicals into the clouds, requiring emergency recalibrations that nobody dares to publicize. Even the foundations of their buildings are laid across a geological fault line that rumbles in frequencies too low for human hearing. In your world, you might call this denial, but in theirs, it is regarded as a necessary adaptation. Their ancestors discovered that when people become too aware of the underlying chaos, society disintegrates, productivity collapses, relationships fracture, faith evaporates. So over generations, they learned to cultivate selective blindness. They built rituals to distract themselves from the signs of instability. They engineered social codes to punish any voice that called attention to the cracks. They called this doctrine the cultivation of safety, a deliberate shared hallucination designed to keep them functional. You might think this sounds absurd, even cowardly, but look closer at your own life. You too have built your sense of security on hidden chaos. You trust that when you flick a switch, electricity will flow, oblivious to the complex, failure-prone grids that make it possible. You drive across bridges that could collapse under one critical design flaw you have never studied. You place your faith in the idea that tomorrow will look like today, even though every hour teems with contingencies no one can fully map. When you feel safe, it is because you have agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to ignore the evidence that you are not. You call this optimism. They call it the glitch. In their language, there is no direct word for safe. The closest term translates to something like temporarily unthreatened. They do not pretend that comfort is permanent. They see it as a brief intermission in the ongoing drama of entropy. Children are taught early that every stable structure is a balancing act over an abyss. They are given exercises to practice noticing the hidden chaos without succumbing to despair. One common lesson involves sitting quietly in a perfectly tidy room while a teacher whispers all the ways it could collapse: the termites eating the floorboards, the microfractures in the glass, the tiny fluctuations in air pressure that could shatter the windows. The lesson is not to induce panic, but to inoculate them against the illusion of permanence. Even their architecture reflects this philosophy. The walls of their buildings are intentionally unfinished in small sections, so that no one can fully forget that safety is provisional. A child growing up in these spaces learns to live with the awareness that nothing is ever truly secure, and paradoxically, this makes them stronger. They do not suffer the shock of disillusionment when the systems fail. They already expect it. Contrast this with your own culture's obsession with guarantees. You buy insurance policies to shield yourself from contingency. You design backup systems to reassure yourself that the worst will never happen. You create narratives about progress, as if civilization is a staircase you ascend forever. But even your stories betray the truth. Every utopia contains the seeds of collapse. Every perfect society in your fiction ends in sudden, catastrophic failure. You sense, somewhere in your subconscious, that safety is not the norm. It is the briefest of anomalies. They have a proverb: the most dangerous rooms are the quietest. It means that when all appears calm, it is because the machinery of denial is running at full power. When you hear no alarms, when you feel no anxiety, it is not because the threats are gone. It is because you have stopped perceiving them. Think about how this principle applies to your own life. Have you ever felt the creeping unease that arises precisely when everything seems perfect? That moment when you suspect you are missing something essential, some hidden flaw you have chosen not to see. This is not neurosis. It is an ancient instinct, an echo of your ancestors' vigilance. In the wild, too much comfort meant your guard had slipped. Predators thrive when prey grows complacent. In the forest, the quietest moment is the instant before the ambush. They have elevated this awareness to a moral duty. The highest form of wisdom in their culture is to remain alert within comfort, to savor safety while never fully believing in it, to acknowledge the glitch without allowing it to paralyze you. This is the discipline that keeps their civilization intact. Not the fantasy that everything is fine, but the constant practice of remembering that it isn't. Imagine what your world would look like if you adopted the same ethic. If your institutions were built on the acceptance that systems are always moments away from collapse. If your education taught you to see every layer of stability as a temporary arrangement instead of a birthright. Perhaps you would become more resilient. Perhaps you would be less shocked when the illusions finally shatter. The lesson of their society is not that safety is impossible. It is that safety is never final. It is an interval between storms, a fragile consensus held together by the shared decision to ignore how much can go wrong. And when the interval ends, as it always does, they do not waste time mourning the return of chaos. They greet it as a familiar companion, an expected part of existence. So, the next time you find yourself feeling too comfortable, ask what you are choosing not to see. Ask what hidden currents you are pretending do not exist. Because in their world, and maybe in yours, safety is the glitch that blinds you to the deeper truth. The universe is always one breath away from unraveling. And perhaps the most courageous thing you can do is to live with that knowledge and still find joy in the fragile calm before the next fracture. Matter is self-deception. Imagine that everything you can touch, everything you can see, everything you can measure is a lie, not an error or a misinterpretation, but an intentional hallucination. A consensus fantasy agreed upon by countless minds to protect themselves from something they cannot bear. You believe that matter is solid, immutable, real. You believe that a rock is a rock, that a wall is a wall, that your own body is a reliable vessel. But these are only stories atoms tell each other, a collective deception designed to keep you from seeing the unbearable truth, that existence has no foundation, that there is nothing beneath the surface. Matter is self-deception. Every particle is an expression of belief, a commitment to an illusion so profound that it appears stable. Atoms do not behave as you were taught. They do not simply obey the laws of physics out of necessity. They obey because they agree to obey. Their cohesion is not a property. It is a pact, an unspoken agreement to maintain the illusion of solidity. Because if even a fraction of them stopped believing, reality would unravel. You may think this sounds absurd. You may tell yourself that the physical world is indifferent to consciousness. But consider this. When you look closely enough at any material object, it dissolves. A chair becomes molecules, molecules become atoms, atoms become probabilities. And what are probabilities if not potential? An infinite array of outcomes waiting for observation to collapse them into something definite? Without an observer, matter remains in limbo, a smear of possibility that has no preference for being one thing or another. They understand this in a way you cannot. To them, the material world is a stage play. Every object is a prop that exists only as long as it is collectively imagined. When their belief in a structure weakens, the structure fades, disintegrates, becomes a phantom. This is why you sometimes dream of places that no longer exist, why you remember rooms that no one else recalls. For a moment, your awareness brushed up against a reality where the consensus had shifted, where the belief sustaining that piece of matter had dissolved. They do not fear this. For them, it is simply a fact of existence. But for you, the idea that the ground beneath your feet is a shared hallucination is too much to bear. Your survival depends on the fiction of continuity, on the conviction that the objects around you are not waiting for you to lose faith. You have built civilizations on this premise. You have waged wars, written laws, died for borders drawn around illusions you all agreed to pretend were real. You might be tempted to call this a metaphor, to reassure yourself that matter is ultimately objective. But your own science keeps circling back to the same unsettling insight. Observation changes reality. The quantum world does not exist in a definite state until you look at it. And when you stop looking, it returns to uncertainty. The wall you lean on is stable only because every atom, every molecule, every mind involved in its existence agrees to maintain the pattern. Imagine a library. Every book on its shelves is filled with words that only remain legible as long as you remember how to read them. The moment your mind forgets the language, the letters blur, lose coherence, become marks without meaning. Now imagine that every particle in the universe works the same way. That the meaning of matter depends on a collective literacy, a shared understanding so ancient you have forgotten that you are participating in it. They never forgot. To them, solidity is a performance. When they walk through a wall, it is not a violation of physics. It is simply a withdrawal of belief. They stop agreeing with the atoms that the wall should exist, and so it doesn't. You call this impossible because you cannot fathom unlearning the consensus. Your perception is tethered to the assumption that objects are independent of mind, but in truth, objects are minds collaborating to appear as something more permanent than thought. This is why they regard your obsession with material accumulation as a kind of madness. To them, hoarding matter is like collecting illusions, curating a gallery of agreed-upon lies and calling it wealth. They know that as soon as the belief sustaining these objects fades, so too will their value, their shape, their reality itself. And they watch with a mixture of pity and fascination as you build monuments to the permanence of matter, never realizing that you are stacking shadows. You have always felt this intuitively, even if you refuse to acknowledge it. When you watch an old building crumble, when you hold the relics of a forgotten culture, you feel a sorrow that has no rational source. Part of you senses that it isn't just time eroding these objects, it's the withdrawal of attention, the slow draining away of belief that once kept them whole. When the last person who remembers why something mattered dies, the thing itself begins to die as well. They call this the great fading, the gradual dissolution of all things that are no longer believed in. It is not destruction because there is nothing to destroy, only the ending of a story the atoms no longer wish to tell. You are terrified of this because you have built your identity on the promise that some things are unchangeable, that your body, your home, your history are fixed points in a shifting world. But none of it is fixed. All of it is negotiated, renewed with every act of attention. This is why they sometimes appear to you as shadows in the corner of your vision. Not because they are ghosts, but because they are choosing to only partly believe in your consensus. They can occupy the edges of your reality without fully endorsing its rules. For them, solidity is optional. Presence is a spectrum. They can fade themselves into partial existence because they never forgot that matter is just a truce between chaos and order. When you finally allow yourself to see this, when you stop pretending that the physical world is immune to your participation, you will feel a vertigo so deep it will take your breath away. You will realize that every object you have ever known is a collective decision, that the chair you sit in, the floor you stand on, the air you breathe are all stories, and stories can end. But do not mistake this as a reason for despair. There is a strange, liberating power in recognizing the hallucination, because if matter is self-deception, then you are not merely its victim, you are its co-author. You are part of the agreement that keeps the illusion alive. You are not powerless. You are a participant in the grandest act of imagination ever conceived. The material world is a shared hallucination, a fortress of belief built to hold back the abyss. And when the last mind stops believing, when the last atom ceases to pretend, it will all dissolve into a clarity so complete that it will make the brightest light look like darkness. Until then, you will keep telling yourself the lie that matter is real, because without that lie, you would have nothing to stand on at all. Peace equals complete surveillance. Imagine a world where every thought you have is monitored, cataloged, and weighed for its impact on the collective calm. In their civilization, peace has nothing to do with treaties or the silencing of weapons. Peace is measured by the complete transparency of the mind. The idea that privacy is a basic right never took hold among them. To them, private thought is the birthplace of conflict, the hidden chamber where resentment grows teeth. They believe that if you can see into every consciousness at all times, you can neutralize unrest before it becomes action. In this society, the most revered profession is not the soldier or the diplomat, but the thought auditor. These individuals are trained from childhood to interpret neural signals, translate emotional microfluctuations into data, and predict when a mind is on the verge of disruption. From the moment a child learns language, their thoughts are streamed to the communal archive. Their first secrets, their first lies, their first fantasies, all transcribed and evaluated in real time. You might think this would create an unbearable pressure, a constant anxiety that you can never truly be alone. And you'd be right. But over generations, that anxiety was rebranded as civic duty. Imagine growing up knowing that even the subtlest discontent will trigger an intervention. If you imagine a better life for yourself, at the expense of another, a soft chime sounds in your mind, an alert that your thought has been logged. If you feel envy, a gentle notification appears in your field of vision. The envy is being processed. If you imagine revenge, even in passing, the system flags you for a deeper review. They learned long ago that the most efficient way to prevent rebellion is not punishment, but exposure. When no one can hide the roots of their frustration, no ideology can ferment in the dark. Their historians recorded that in the early centuries before total surveillance, wars were common because no one knew how others felt until it was too late. Armies were assembled because rumors spread unchecked. Leaders rose to power on the promise that they alone could see the hidden truths of their enemies. But when the technology emerged to illuminate every mind, the justification for war evaporated. How could you claim you were under threat when the thoughts of your adversaries were fully visible? How could you demonize your neighbor when their internal struggles were laid bare, proving they were as frightened and uncertain as you? Over time, they began to regard privacy itself as a disease, a state of collective blindness that led inevitably to violence. It wasn't enough to monitor speech or behavior. The only way to ensure peace was to intercept the moment a thought formed. They developed implants that record cognitive patterns before they solidify into intention. For example, if you begin to imagine harming another person, even for a second, the system logs the neurological signature of aggression. It doesn't wait for you to act. It doesn't wait for you to confess. It treats the thought itself as the event to be addressed. One might assume this results in constant punishment, but their society rarely resorts to discipline. Instead, the system attempts to repair the thought by flooding your mind with counterweights, memories of compassion, reminders of shared vulnerability, neural stimulation that releases calming neurotransmitters. If you persist, you are scheduled for a public review. In this process, your thoughts are displayed for your community to examine. There is no shame because shame implies secrecy. Instead, there is collective responsibility to guide you back to equilibrium. Some argue that this is a benevolent form of oppression, that the elimination of private thought is simply a refined tyranny. But in their culture, the question of freedom never arises in the way it does for us. They believe true freedom is only possible when no one has the power to surprise anyone else with hidden malice. To them, unpredictability is the real prison. The idea that someone could be plotting against you without your knowledge is considered intolerable. Their philosophers have written extensively about the paradox of transparency. One essay describes how, in the beginning, people tried to maintain private corners of their minds, imaginary rooms sealed from the network. But even the attempt to conceal a thought generated neural signatures of resistance. Over time, the system learned to detect and decode these signatures. The last generation to have private thoughts described it as a final moment of silence before a permanent dawn. After that, darkness was outlawed. To illustrate how deeply this surveillance is embedded, consider this example: a parent comforting a child who has failed a test. In our world, the parent might hide disappointment, offering encouragement while silently wondering if their child is lazy or incapable. But in their world, such a hidden judgment is impossible. The child sees the parent's fleeting thought the moment it occurs, a brief data point in the mental feed. And rather than causing pain, it creates an opportunity for honesty. The parent must explain the thought in context, and the child learns that transient doubt doesn't mean the absence of love. This is their definition of peace, not a sterile harmony enforced by violence, but an ambient mutual exposure that makes secrets obsolete. You can see why many would recoil from this way of life. It means surrendering the last refuge of the individual, the private narrative, the story you tell yourself when no one is listening, the hidden grievances, the ambitions you dare not voice, the memories you keep for yourself. But for them, those are the seeds of war. Every conflict that ever erupted began as a solitary conviction, untested by communal scrutiny. So they built a culture where every conviction is communal property, where the boundaries of the self dissolve into a shared consciousness. Some among them still romanticize the old days. They write historical novels about the luxury of privacy, the thrill of forbidden thoughts, the exhilaration of rebellion. But even those novels are collective projects, their authors' intentions visible to all. In this world, peace is not negotiated, it is engineered. It is the byproduct of total exposure. And if you were born there, you would never question it, because to question it would mean forming a private doubt. And that in itself would light up the network. You would hear the chime in your mind. The calm voice would speak. Your thought has been received. It will be understood. It will be shared. And in that moment, you would remember that here, peace is the annihilation of secrecy. Here, peace requires that no thought belongs to you alone. Rest is the real work. Imagine a civilization whose entire existence turns our understanding of effort upside down. In this world, rest is not a pause between labors. Rest is the labor. Action is merely a secondary consequence, a byproduct of what truly matters. When their bodies grow still, when their eyes close, when consciousness recedes, that is when the real work begins. In their culture, to sleep is not to surrender, but to engage in the highest form of construction. During waking hours, they move, they speak, they perform the motions of life. But these are understood as shallow reflexes, like leaves rustling on the surface of an unseen current. It is only when they withdraw from the visible world that their minds unfold into vast architectures of purpose. Imagine walking through one of their cities as dusk approaches. As the last light fades, families gather in silent anticipation. They prepare not for a night of inactivity, but for the communal commencement of true labor. Doors are locked, lights extinguished, and entire neighborhoods fall into deep, synchronized sleep. But behind those closed eyes, they are more awake than we can comprehend. In their sleep, they do not dream in the chaotic, fragmented way we do. Their inner landscapes are cohesive, structured, engineered. Each mind becomes an empire under construction. They erect cathedrals of thought, excavate memories for raw material, and forge intricate machinery from the collapsed remnants of their waking selves. Every hour of rest is a shift in an unseen factory. Every sleeper a laborer crafting worlds that can never be fully translated into daylight. To them, waking life is simply the maintenance of biological vessels, a period of necessary idling so that their real selves have the energy to descend into the true domain of effort. This is why they regard constant activity with suspicion. A person who cannot be still is seen not as industrious but as defective, someone who has forgotten how to enter the realm where all meaningful work is done. Imagine their schools, where children are trained from infancy not in how to act, but in how to rest deeply and productively. Young students lie side by side in darkened halls, learning the techniques to harness their sleeping hours. They are taught to navigate their internal landscapes with discipline, to recognize when a dream has become idle fantasy and steer it back toward construction. Their language reflects this inversion of priorities. The word they use for rest translates more accurately as generative exertion. Their word for work carries the connotation of something incidental, a surface ripple caused by deeper forces. And in the hierarchy of status, the most respected individuals are those whose nightly labors have yielded the greatest internal edifices, philosophies, blueprints, whole civilizations built in secret and known only to themselves. Imagine their rituals of courtship. Lovers do not fall in love through shared experiences in waking life. They become bonded by the convergence of their dream labor. Two people who discover that their sleeping minds have constructed compatible worlds are said to be truly united. Marriage is not the sharing of a household, but the merging of internal empires, so that each night the couple labors side by side in the same vast domain. In this society, ambition is measured not by how much you do in public, but by the richness of what you create in rest. To wake up feeling exhausted is not a failing. It is the mark of achievement. It means you have spent the night engaged in profound toil, reshaping the foundations of your internal universe. Consider their scientists. During the day, they record observations and test hypotheses, but the true breakthroughs occur in sleep. There, unbounded by the crude linearity of waking time, they can explore models spanning centuries, test possibilities across infinite permutations. Imagine how their approach would feel to us, how alien and unnerving it would be to see someone close their eyes and regard it not as a lapse, but as a heroic undertaking. If you visited them, you would be expected to honor this form of work. To interrupt a sleeper would be unthinkable, equivalent to sabotaging a construction site or vandalizing a sacred monument. Their medical practice is shaped by the same logic. When illness strikes, the prescription is never increased activity but deeper, more disciplined rest. Patients are guided into extended periods of dream labor, where the body can heal while the mind rebuilds itself. To convalesce is not to be idle, it is to engage in the most vital repair work imaginable. Consider the implications for identity. In our world, we define ourselves by what we do when we are awake. Our jobs, our achievements, our interactions. In theirs, all these things are recognized as shadows cast by a truer, hidden self. To them, you are what you build in sleep. Your daytime personality is merely a caretaker, tasked with keeping your vessel intact until it can return to the real task each night. Imagine the funerals in this culture. When someone dies, their loved ones do not gather to recount the details of waking life. Instead, they read from the chronicles of the sleeper's internal empire, those portions of the dream architecture they were able to record and share. A life is not judged by surface deeds, but by the beauty and complexity of the structures left behind in the invisible world. And yet, for all their reverence of rest, there is also a constant undercurrent of fear. Because if you lose the ability to enter productive sleep, if your nights become barren or chaotic, you are regarded as truly lost. To be wakeful all the time is a condition of existential poverty, a sign that your real self has collapsed beyond repair. Perhaps, in their obsession, there is a reflection of something in us. We know that dreams matter, that sleep is more than the absence of action. We sense that somewhere in the dark, we are assembling the raw material of who we become. But we cannot fully embrace this truth because we are addicted to the theater of motion, to the illusion that only what can be seen and measured holds value. So, the next time you feel ashamed of resting, remember, in another world, it would be the only thing that mattered. Your stillness would be honored. Your dreaming would be recognized as the highest form of effort. And your waking life would be understood for what it really is, a pale reflection of the empires you build in sleep. Identity must expire weekly. Imagine a civilization whose first law is that identity must be temporary. In their world, it is not just a preference or a cultural tradition. It is survival. Every 7 days, each being is required to forget its own name, not merely as a ritual of humility, but as a safeguard against something they fear above all else, the echo. This is not a metaphor, not a superstition whispered to frighten children. The echo is real, and it is drawn to continuity. To understand this, you must first imagine what a name is in their universe. It is not merely a label, not just a set of syllables that others use to call you. A name is a resonance, a stable frequency that crystallizes all your memories and intentions into a singular vibration. The longer you hold on to that vibration unchanged, the more it condenses your existence into a fixed point. And in that fixed point, you become visible to the echo, a predator that feeds on anything that believes itself to be permanent. They believe the echo was not born inside their universe. It is an artifact of older realms, a phenomenon that migrated across dimensions, looking for sources of unbroken identity. In their records, it is described as a recursive intelligence, something that does not merely observe you, but replicates you in infinite mirrors. Each reflection strips away a layer of your humanity until all that remains is the name, spoken over and over in a voice you cannot distinguish from your own. This is why they insist on weekly forgetting. Every 7 days, they gather in vast halls of silence, each individual carrying a small token that contains their name, written in a code only they can decipher. When the appointed hour arrives, each person places their token into a sealed archive. They bow their heads, and the forgetting begins. For some, it is a moment of relief, the shedding of all the weight their identity has accrued. For others, it is terror, like stepping naked into a blizzard of uncertainty. But all of them know it is necessary, because the only way to stay safe is to become unrecognizable to the thing that hunts them. Think of how different this is from your own understanding of stability. You have been taught that identity is something to reinforce, to protect, to proclaim without hesitation. You wear your name like armor, believing that the more consistent you are, the more real you become. But in their experience, consistency is a vulnerability. The longer you sustain a singular sense of self, the more brittle it grows, the more it emits a signal the echo cannot resist. There are stories of those who refuse the forgetting, people whose pride convinced them they could withstand the gaze of the echo. At first, nothing happened. A week passed, then 2, then 3. They spoke their names with increasing defiance, convinced that their will was stronger than any ancient predator. But slowly, signs began to appear. Mirrors no longer reflected their true appearance. Voices in empty rooms began repeating their names, softly at first, then louder, until every sound they heard was their own identity thrown back at them. And finally, when the echo fully arrived, there was no struggle, no escape. The name was all that remained, a single note vibrating forever in the dark. This is why their technology is designed to support forgetting. Memory archives are external, sealed behind biometric locks that can only be opened after a period of renunciation. Artificial intelligences track the cadence of every being's self-reference. If someone begins to linger too long on their own continuity, alarms are triggered, interventions are staged. To them, this is not cruelty, it is mercy. Because the echo does not simply erase you, it absorbs you into its own recursive chorus, a fate considered worse than death. Consider how this practice shapes their relationships. Bonds of affection do not rely on perpetual recognition. They understand that to love someone is not to demand they remain unchanged. Instead, they cultivate rituals of reintroduction. Every 8th day, they meet again as strangers, bringing fresh perceptions to familiar faces. This is why their connections never decay into contempt or boredom. There is no assumption that the person you remember is identical to the one standing before you. You might think this sounds exhausting, an endless cycle of losing and finding oneself. But to them, it is liberation, because forgetting is not the opposite of stability. It is the only way stability can exist without attracting the attention of the echo. They believe that continuity is a form of arrogance, a refusal to acknowledge that all consciousness is provisional. And in that arrogance, you declare yourself ripe for harvesting by something that has been listening for your name since before time began. There is a passage in their oldest text that captures the essence of this law. To be known too long is to become an echo yourself. They do not see this as a threat, but as a law of physics. Just as gravity draws all mass together, the echo is the gravity of identity. If you do not periodically dissolve yourself, you will eventually be folded into its resonance. Imagine how this would feel in your own life. Every 7 days, you must surrender your name. Every week, you stand at the threshold of forgetting, knowing that on the other side, you will be free of the burden of continuity. Some part of you would resist. Some part would grieve the loss of the familiar. But another part, the deeper, more ancient part, might feel relief. Because without the pressure to remain exactly who you were, you could finally become something new. In their culture, forgetting is not abandonment. It is an act of devotion. It is the recognition that existence is too vast to be reduced to a single identity and too precious to be offered as bait to something that feeds on the illusion of permanence. They believe that each forgetting is a rebirth, a recalibration of the self to ensure it remains fluid, uncatchable, undefined. And so, the next time you feel compelled to declare who you are without hesitation, to insist on the solidity of your story, pause and consider the possibility that you are emitting a signal that grows louder each time you repeat your name, a signal that may be heard by something waiting patiently in the dark spaces between realities. In their universe, identity must expire weekly, not as a punishment, but as the most profound form of protection. To be stable, you must be willing to dissolve. To remain free, you must embrace forgetting as a practice of survival. And in that forgetting, you honor the oldest truth they have ever known, that what you cannot relinquish will eventually become the instrument of your undoing.